Chapter 400. Forza was not in a hurry to join the battle. He just watched from the sidelines. Han Jin and Xavier could only dodge the attacks of the behemoth. Han Jin didn't mind. He had grown up from the bottom of the world, and he had done things that hurt his self-esteem more than this. But Xavier couldn't stand it anymore. He was the elder of Dragon City. He was respected both in Dragon City and outside the continent. He couldn't stand being humiliated by a few magical beasts. Two bright flames ignited in Xavier's eyes, and then a majestic wave suddenly appeared. Xavier's body expanded rapidly, and in the blink of an eye, he turned into a giant dragon. Han Jin and Force's bodies were particularly small compared to the behemoth. But at this moment, the behemoths were dwarfs in front of Xavier. The pair of huge wings spread out, as if they could cover all the behemoths under them. The golden scales all over his body were 1/2 meter in radius. They were smooth and glossy, with bright jewels. The curves of his body were smooth, vigorous, and proud, exuding a noble aura. The next moment, Xavier opened his huge mouth, and a dragon's breath came out of it. The dragon's breath was also affected by the gravity enchantment. The trajectory of the dragon's breath was in an arc, but the behemoth that provoked Xavier's anger was too close, and it was sprayed directly. Xavier's original intention was to burn the ugly face of the behemoth into charcoal, but the dragon breath ended up landing on the behemoth's chest and abdomen. Although the location of the dragon breath was different, it still caused a lot of damage. An unpleasant burning smell came from the behemoth's chest and abdomen. A deep hole about 6 meters wide was burned into the behemoth's abdomen. The inside of the hole was burned into a mess, and there were more than a dozen places that were still emitting smoke. The behemoth was also pushed to the ground by the impact of the dragon breath. The weakness of the behemoth was undoubtedly exposed at this moment. However, the behemoth was stimulated by the severe pain and became even crazier. It quickly got up, roared, and rushed to Xavier again. Its sharp claws were pointing at Xavier's chest and abdomen. It wanted to dig a big hole there too. Xavier opened his mouth again and sprayed out another dragon's breath. His fighting power was much stronger than that of an ordinary golden dragon. At least he didn't have to wait and could release dragon's breath continuously. Xavier was like all powerhouses of the same rank. He had rich battle experience. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to reach this step. He almost immediately grasped the deviation caused by the gravity enchantment and adjusted in time. The second dragon's breath just happened to hit the behemoth's head. The crystal eye mask protecting the behemoth's eyes was instantly shattered. The long hair on the behemoth's head was also swept away. Han Jin could clearly see the muscles on the behemoth's face were rapidly corroding and withering. He even saw the process of the behemoth's eyes melting and burning. In an instant, the behemoth's head had turned into a huge skull. No matter what kind of magical beast it was, including dragons, if they wanted to move, they had to rely on their nerves to control their body. It was hard to imagine that there was any nerve center in the behemoth's head when it was burned like this. The behemoth's body stiffened. Then, with a loud bang, half of its body was smashed into the ground. However, vicious beasts were vicious beasts. The remaining behemoths weren't frightened. The other two behemoths gave up on Han Jin at the same time and rushed towards Xavier with their companions. Xavier's dragon's breath was still able to release a huge amount of damage in the gravity enchantment. The golden dragons were somewhat inferior. Their breath could at most attack a dozen meters in front of them. Moreover, they couldn't move. On the other hand, there were more than a dozen behemoths that rushed over. They formed a circle and hunted the golden dragons one by one. As for the green dragons that were waiting for death, they didn't have the time to pay attention to them. Every golden dragon that was surrounded was desperately resisting, spitting flames with all their might. However, the behemoths weren't complete fools. At least, they knew how to hunt. The behemoths in the front were responsible for attracting the golden dragon's attention, while their companions in the blind spots launched fatal attacks. Of course, if the golden dragons turned their heads and spat out dragon's breath, then they would have to attack from the front. Anyone could see that it was only a matter of time before the 9 golden dragons were killed, unless they could get help. Unfortunately, Xavier couldn't even take care of himself, and Han Jin was affected by the gravity enchantment. His fighting strength was sharply reduced, so no one was willing to help them. Facing 5 behemoths that rushed over side by side, Xavier retreated while spitting out dragon's breath again. He also tried to turn his head and let the flames of the dragon's breath envelop the 5 behemoths. It was true that the behemoth's magic resistance was very weak, but it wasn't ridiculously weak. However, compared to other top-ranked magic beasts, the 5 behemoths' bodies were charred black under the dragon's breath. Their long hair was all burned off, as if they had been shaved off by someone. However, they only suffered some damage to their skin and didn't lose their ability to move. They continued to rush towards Xavier. Xavier immediately realized that he had made a mistake. He opened his mouth again, and a surge of flames enveloped the nearest behemoth. That behemoth subconsciously dodged, but under the influence of the gravity enchantment, its movements weren't very nimble. The dragon's breath fell on its shoulder and started to burn fiercely. The behemoth let out a painful howl. The terrifying temperature of the flames was corroding its flesh, revealing the bones inside. However, its movements were not slow. Instead, it was fast. It closed in on Xavier, opened its huge claws, and tried to dig out Xavier's heart. Xavier tried his best to dodge, but his reaction wasn't very nimble. The behemoth's sharp claws swept across his abdomen, leaving 4 deep wounds. Moreover, more than a dozen dragon scales were forcibly torn off. Xavier roared in pain, and another dragon's breath fiercely poured down. Because of the distance, the behemoth could be considered to have absorbed everything. The dark yellow flames poured down from its head and spread down its chest and back, enveloping its entire body in a sea of fire. Not to mention the Beeman behemoth, even the gold dragon with its strong magic resistance couldn't withstand Xavier's breath at such a short distance. The Beeman behemoth was instantly turned into a hairless beast. Not only was its skull charred, but countless cracks had also appeared on its skull. It was as if the ground had cracked after a long period of drought. Then, its body fell straight to the ground, just like its companion just now. Enough! Forza suddenly roared, and then his body inflated little by little like a balloon filled with air. Unlike Xavier, who almost instantly returned to his original body after the ultimate transformation, Forza's expansion speed was much slower. The others could clearly see the changes happening to him. Han Jin had already learned about the talent of the Golden Blood family. His expression didn't change at all. This was what he expected. Xavier was too lazy to observe Forza. He had been retreating quickly, trying his best to distance himself from the behemoth. Then, he opened his mouth and spat out another dragon's breath. He had learned his lesson. Every time he used his dragon's breath, he would only attack one enemy. While spitting out the dragon's breath, he also took the time to glance behind him. Out of the 9 superior gold dragons, 4 had been knocked down. Among the behemoths, only one had lost its fighting power. Xavier was very clear that he was powerless to save his companions. He had to leave the battle before the behemoths came back. Otherwise, he would die. But he didn't want to escape in a hurry. No matter what, even if he failed today, he had to make Forza pay the corresponding price. The behemoth that was attacked hurriedly leaned to one side, trying to avoid the dragon's breath. But Xavier's attack seemed to be getting more and more skillful, and the angle was getting more and more tricky, which proved that his adaptability was very strong. The dragon's breath was sprayed on the waist of the behemoth. A crescent-shaped wound appeared on the behemoth's waist, as if a large piece of muscle had been bitten off by another giant beast. From Han Jin's point of view, he could even see the white, still-moving hip bone. Then the behemoth let out a sad cry, lost its balance, and fell down. But it couldn't die quickly, so it crawled on the ground and howled. "I'll let you see the strongest force of the Golden Blood family," Forza said coldly. At this moment, he had turned into a behemoth that could talk. The only difference was that in his bloody mouth, there were two curved giant fangs, and he was shorter than the other behemoths. His hair was also different. The long hair of the other behemoths was mostly grayish-black or grayish-brown, but Forza was covered with gorgeous long silver hair. The next moment, Forza's huge body leaned forward, and suddenly a cloud of sand splashed behind him. He flew straight up more than 10 meters into the air, and with just one step, he leaped dozens of meters away, approaching Xavier, as if he was not affected by the gravity enchantment at all. This kind of battle scene was a bit unfair to Xavier, because Han Jin was fine. It was useless to blame others. Han Jin's fighting style was no longer a secret. If he was rational, he wouldn't imagine killing Han Jin, because it was meaningless. If he had to kill Han Jin, he had to use tricks such as sneak attacks, ambushes, and so on. Otherwise, not only would he fail to achieve his goal, but he would also cause endless trouble for himself. Han Jin's eyebrows twitched imperceptibly, while Xavier's face turned pale with fright. He immediately opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of dragon's breath at Forza, ignoring the behemoths that were rushing towards him. Xavier had just adapted to the slow fight, and Forza's swift figure had a huge impact on his psyche. Forza took a wrong step and jumped up again. He was right behind Xavier. At the moment when the two giants crossed each other, Forza waved his left claw and left 4 deep wounds on Xavier's belly. It was hard to see how deep the wounds were, but the flesh on the edge of the wounds was almost half a meter thick. Blood gushed out and flowed down Xavier's belly like a small waterfall. Xavier's whole body was trembling with pain, but his fighting spirit was still tenacious. He quickly changed his direction and retreated, then turned his head and sprayed a dragon's breath at Forza. As an elder of Dragon City, Xavier's most powerful force was magic, but in the gravity enchantment, he could only rely on the primitive dragon's breath to fight, which was a tragedy that he had to accept. Forza's tyrannical strength was fully proved by his swift movements in the gravity enchantment. He spun his body, then jumped up and brushed past Xavier. He stretched out his left claw again and left 4 deep wounds on Xavier's back. Xavier was in so much pain that he could hardly breathe. He took a step to the side, and his body seemed to have lost its balance. He staggered and was about to fall. "Die," Forza said coldly. Then he jumped up and shot straight at Xavier. His right claw was half stretched and half bent, pointing at Xavier's chest. It seemed that he wanted to dig out Xavier's heart. A look of despair appeared in Xavier's eyes. He continued to stagger, trying his best to keep himself from falling. Moreover, he still hadn't spat out any dragon breath. His strength should have been exhausted. The reason why the dragon god's heart was known as the dragon race's sacred artifact was that it allowed a dragon to have unlimited recovery power. Even with Xavier's strength, he wouldn't be able to withstand such a huge consumption. Suddenly, Forza's claw pierced deeply into Xavier's chest. Something unexpected happened. The despair in Xavier's eyes turned into a strong madness at the same time. He opened his relatively short arms and hugged Forza to his chest, as if he was holding a child. The dragon's breath covered half of Forza's body, including Xavier's, in a sea of fire. Perhaps it was because of Han Jin and Xavier's unscrupulous ridicule before the battle that Forza couldn't keep calm. Perhaps it was because Forza's 2 attacks were so easy that he had overestimated the influence of the gravity enchantment and underestimated the fighting strength of an elder of Dragon City. In short, he had made a big mistake. Forza only thought that he was a fearless and courageous real warrior. He didn't know that in the long history of any intelligent race, there had been many tragic stories. What's more, Xavier had his own self-esteem and principles. If he ran away in a panic without caring about the life or death of his companions, how could he return to Dragon City and continue to be an elder? Of course, he would leave. But before he left, he had to make Forza pay the price. Sometimes, he had to do something for something. It was a kind of madness, which had the same effect as the orc's madness. Forza let out a painful howl, but his reaction speed was very fast. He immediately stretched out his left claw, clasped Xavier's throat, and desperately pushed Xavier's head upward. The dragon's breath finally left Forza's body and sprayed in the air. Then Forza used all his strength to twist his body and pull out his right claw. His feet also stepped on Xavier's lower abdomen and kicked hard, trying to break free. Compared with Forza, who had turned into a behemoth, Xavier's pure strength was not small. Under Forza's crazy tearing, there were more and more shocking wounds on his chest. Finally, he couldn't hold on anymore, and his arms helplessly loosened little by little. Forza felt Xavier's exhaustion, and at the same time, his feet exerted force on Xavier's belly. He broke free from Xavier's desperate embrace, rolled on the ground, and hurriedly retreated. Almost all of Foss's hair had been burned off, especially his head, which had become shiny. One of his eyes was closed tightly, and the other was narrowed into a slit. The behemoth's biggest weakness was its eyes, and Fossa was no exception. In the dragon's breath, both of his eyes had suffered varying degrees of damage. When the behemoths saw that Forza was injured, they roared together and rushed to Xavier. They wanted to avenge their king. Xavier finally lost his balance after Forza's last kick and fell to the ground. His huge body was like a moving hill, constantly struggling there. There were more than 20 deep wounds on his chest, and there was also an unfathomable hole. He had almost turned into a blood dragon. "Raphael, save me!" Xavier struggled to get up and shouted for help. At this time, he could no longer continue to fight. Although he still couldn't save his companions, at least he had a reason to forgive himself. "Go!" Han Jin, who had been watching the scene for a long time, finally moved and then roared, "Kill!" Han Jin raised his right hand, and a deep purple light appeared in his hand, and immediately turned into something like a dagger. Then Han Jin's right hand thrust forward, and a condensed beam of light shot straight forward, piercing the chest of a behemoth. Looking at Han Jin and the behemoth's figures, Han Jin looked like a little bug trying to challenge a giant with an absurdly long toothpick. However, the toothpick's sharpness was far beyond imagination. The other end of the light beam pierced into the behemoth's body as easily as cutting tofu. "Kill! Kill!" Han Jin was in high spirits, and his aura was threatening. He was like a heavenly general that had descended to the mortal world. The beam of light in his hand continuously pierced the behemoth's body, leaving a dozen deep wounds. 3 of the wounds pierced the behemoth's head, and finally, the behemoth couldn't hold on any longer. It staggered a few steps forward, and then its body fell down with a loud bang. Xavier was stunned at first, but then he was overjoyed. Although he had heard of Han Jin's strength, he never thought that he would be able to unleash such a powerful combat strength. With such a miraculous magic item, there was still hope for them to win. Han Jin's body stiffened and his face turned red. His right arm hung limply by his side, and then he couldn't help but kneel on the ground. "Go! Go!" Han Jin suddenly raised his head and roared. Xavier immediately realized that Han Jin could only increase his combat strength in an instant, and the time he could maintain it was very limited. He hurriedly used all his strength, struggled to get up, turned around, and fled in the opposite direction. At this time, he saw that the 9 superior gold dragons had all been killed, leaving only 2 behemoths to continue slaughtering the immobile green dragons. The rest of the behemoths had already rushed towards them. However, Xavier had just been delayed, and Han Jin was temporarily unable to make a move. A behemoth had already rushed behind Xavier, stretched out its huge claws, and grabbed the tail behind him. Blood splashed, and Xavier's tail was cut in 2. Facts once again proved the wisdom of the behemoth. If it had grabbed Xavier's tail and didn't let go, it would have been a disaster for Xavier, and a big problem for Han Jin. The tail being cut off actually helped Xavier. With an earth-shattering roar, Xavier's huge body moved more than 100 meters away, as if he wasn't affected by gravity, just like Forza. Then, he didn't dare to look back, and used his long wings to maintain his balance, desperately escaping into the distance. Go! Han Jin's figure once again straightened up. He was telling Xavier with his actions that he would persist until he escaped safely. Chapter 401. After Xavier rushed out of the gravity enchantment and flew into the sky, Han Jin also sank into the ground. He was not a person who liked to fight, so it was meaningless to stay and continue to fight. Although the result was good, Forza felt both happy and worried. He was happy that he had finally solved the problem of the dragon, but he was worried about where to go in the future. His worry had nothing to do with his injury, but because of the hostility shown by Han Jin. He could not figure out why Han Jin refused his kindness. Since the beginning of the war, Forza had been trying his best to avoid killing the people of the Holy Crown City. In the long winter, the elder of the elves, Amphila, had asked Lionel many times, asking the orcs to attack the citadel of the Holy Crown City. Whenever Lionel asked him for instructions, he always asked Lionel to find an excuse to refuse. Now that he thought about it, Amphila's kindness was in vain. Forza was both happy and worried, but for the oriole behind the mantis stalking the cicada, his heart was full of excitement. The range of the gravity enchantment was so wide that even the forest in the distance was affected. The forest on the edge of the enchantment was more than 100 meters in radius, and it was full of tree trunks that sank deep into the ground. There were also branches, leaves, and bushes that clung to the ground. But after walking for dozens of meters, 2 pairs of bright eyes could be seen. They were Amphila and Prudence. Gaobin suddenly held a secret meeting last night and invited the patriarchs of several big tribes. At the meeting, Gaobin proposed an amazing plan. According to the reliable information he had received, Lord Raphael would meet with Dragon City Elder Xavier near the Holy Crown City. Forza had also received this information. He did not want to see Raphael and Dragon City forming an alliance, so he was ready to completely destroy the meeting. Gaobin asked several patriarchs to select the most elite warriors of their tribes and set out with him to attack Forza. In Gaobin's view, this operation was foolproof. Raphael was very powerful, and Xavier was an elder of Dragon City, not to mention Forza. Forza's advantage was not big. At most, he would win a Pyrrhic victory. Gaobin would lead the elves to kill Forza at that time. He was 90% sure that he could kill Forza on the spot. At that time, some patriarchs doubted that Han Jin could hide underground at any time, while Xavier had the ability to fly. Was Forza crazy? You want to deal with these 2 experts. What's more, Xavier had only been away from the elves for 10 days, and he had taken all the dragons with him. With so many dragons helping him, Forza's chances of success were slim. Gaobin didn't give a detailed explanation on this issue. He just said that Forza seemed very confident when he made the plan. As for why he was so confident, Gaobin didn't know. However, he could guarantee the authenticity of the information with his life. Some tribal chiefs asked about the source of the information, but Gaobin avoided answering. Then he changed the topic and told them that each tribe only needed to give him 50 to 200 elite archers. Together with more than 600 elite archers from the Wild Willow City, Forza's army would not be able to defeat Gaobin even if they had only won by a small margin. As a result, some patriarchs expressed their doubts. What if this was a trap set by Forza? Gaobin had taken so many elite archers, and almost half of the high-end strike force of the Elven Coalition had been used up. If they failed and were ambushed by the orcs, the consequences would be unimaginable. Gaobin asked the elder. If they didn't do anything, and the Holy Crown City refused to ally with the elves, how many days could they hold on? What's more, this information was true. At that time, all the dragons would be lost, and Forza would have nothing to worry about. He could send all the behemoths and mountain giants to the battlefield, and a large number of thunderbirds could fly freely in the sky. Not to mention defeating the orcs. Even if they started to escape now, they might not be able to escape. Gao Bin's secret meeting lasted for a long time. Later, he succeeded in persuading the patriarchs and got a large number of elite archers. The most important thing was that Gao Bin's confidence was very contagious. He even mentioned that when Force's body was brought back, the first thing he should do was to ask Abdurrah to submit his resignation to the United Senate. Abdurrah was repeatedly played by Forza, and Gao Bin only took less than 2,000 elves to kill Forza. He was qualified to ask Abdurrah to resign. It was Gao Bin who first discovered the conspiracy of the orcs. He and Lydia had saved many elves, so the patriarchs who attended the meeting believed in Gao Bin very much. In addition, they were helpless about the future of the elves, so they were persuaded by Gao Bin one after another. But there was no such thing as an impenetrable wall in the world. After Abdurrah realized that his position was in danger, he had been paying attention to Gao Bin's movements and had made arrangements early. Less than half an hour after Gao Bin announced the dismissal of the meeting, Abdurrah knew all of this. First of all, when Elder Xavier of Dragon City took the dragons away, he said that fighting like before would not change the situation. He was going to lead the dragons to find a chance to directly attack Force's palace. In the words of another world, it was to finish the job in one fell swoop. Xavier could not contact Raphael privately. Raphael and Dragon City had already formed a deep hatred. How could he end it all at once? Even if Xavier wanted to form an alliance with the Holy Crown City, he should have contacted Raphael through the elves. After all, Sunir was a member of the elves and had an advantage that Dragon City couldn't compare with. As for Force's plan to attack Xavier, it was even more absurd. With the fighting strength of the orcs, it was impossible for them to pose a threat to the dragons flying in the sky. It was even more impossible for them to attack Raphael. Abdurrah had personally experienced the power of Raphael. Moreover, even if what Gao Bin said was true, that Forza wanted to attack Xavier, it must be a top secret. Even among the orcs there were very few people who knew this secret. Where did Gao Bin get this information? In short, Abdurrah felt that Gao Bin had other intentions. However, Abdurrah believed in Gao Bin. It was interesting to say that he was very hostile to Gao Bin, but he also believed in Gao Bin. This was a bit contradictory, but it was reasonable when he thought about it deeply. Abdurrah and Gao Bin had cooperated for a period of time before. One was a religious leader and the other was a military commander. They got along well. Abdurrah knew Gao Bin well. In fact, Gao Bin had done a lot of amazing things. No one could understand him at that time, but later he was proven right. Out of habit, Abdurrah believed that Gao Bin, who was always good at creating miracles, had once again mastered something. Abdurrah and Abdurrah discussed for a long time, even longer than Gao Bin's secret meeting. In the end, Abdurrah's worried words quickly unified the two elves' thoughts. If Gao Bin really killed Forza, what should we do? If Gao Bin could kill Forza, he could use his skyrocketing reputation to force Abdurrah to step down. In that case, it was the same on the other hand. Abdurrah could use this to consolidate his position, and Abdurrah could also take back his power. Over the past few days, Prudence was in a much more difficult situation than Ampugula. Although Ampugula had become a one-eyed dragon, he was still the great elder of the United Senate and still enjoyed the respect of the elves. Prudence, on the other hand, had almost become a general without an army. Only his original guards still obeyed his command, which was a huge difference from before. Moreover, he was almost always looked down upon by the elves. Moreover, in his heart, Prudence had unspeakable complaints about Ampudra. Ampudra was too ruthless. He even dug out one of his own eyes in the middle of a meeting of the Senate. As an accomplice, shouldn't he, Prudence, do something about it? Unfortunately, Abdurrah was known for his beauty and skill. He was extremely conceited about his appearance. Thinking about it, should he really dig out his own eyes? Or cut something off? Abdurrah was horrified. He couldn't bear to do that to himself. In the end, he lost almost all his power and could not win the forgiveness of the elves. No matter how many tears he shed, no matter how deep his self-reflection was, it could not be compared to the determination shown by Abdurrah in front of countless eyes. Now that the opportunity to take back his power was in front of him, Abdurrah could not help but hesitate. Even without Abdurrah's persuasion, he overturned his doubts one by one. Finally, he joined hands with Abdurrah and was ready to take the first step. Since Abdurrah was still in power, he still had many ways to restrain Gaubin. He instructed the Senate to hold a meeting and asked Gaubin to attend. At the same time, he transferred several clan leaders to another camp to prevent Gaubin from meeting them. Then, he placed his trusted subordinates among the elite archers of Wild Willow City. If Gaubin could not restrain them in the end, when Gaubin led the elite archers to sneak out of the camp and was about to rush to the Holy Crown City, those elite archers would try to attract the attention of the orcs. In addition, Abdurrah were very careful. At the beginning, the elves all stopped dozens of miles away. Only Abdurrah sneaked in to observe the situation. After seeing Han, Jean, and Xavier with his own eyes, he finally believed that what Gaubin said was true. Then he sneaked back and sent out a signal. At this moment, Abdurrah had arrived with the elves. In order to ensure that they would not be discovered, most of the elves stayed in the depths of the jungle. Only Abdurrah were watching the battle that broke out in the gravity enchantment. In fact, they could have launched an attack immediately. Perhaps they would have a chance to save some superior gold dragons and green dragons. However, Abdurrah both chose to remain silent. To put it bluntly, it was nothing more than envy. Although Dragon City had formed an alliance with the elves, the status of the two sides was not equal. The former was the boss, while the latter was the employee. Abdurrah originally thought that he was the most valued by the boss, but when he saw the boss suddenly favor another employee, it was impossible to say that he did not have any feelings. Forza didn't feel anything. He had returned to his original appearance and changed into a new set of clothes. Looking at the mountain-like dragon corpses, Forza couldn't smile. If it were the mercenaries of isolated Cliff City, many of them would have fainted on the spot, become ignorant wooden men, or even have a myocardial infarction. However, the dragon corpses were not of much use to Forza. No one was willing to do business with him, and he was too lazy to do business with anyone. If he liked something, he would just grab it. The priceless dragon crystals were just beautiful stones for him. The dragon scales could be made into armor, and the dragon tendons could be made into strong bows. Unfortunately, they were even more useless. There were no alchemists or archers in the clan. Who would make armor? Who would use the strong bows? However, he had to take these dragons away. He couldn't let others take advantage of them. Forza looked up at the sky. It should be dawn in a few hours, but why hadn't the gravity enchantment disappeared? It was too difficult to drag the dragon corpses out of the gravity enchantment. The remaining dozen behemoths gathered around their dead companions, whimpering like ghosts. After all, they were top-grade holy animals, and they also knew how to grieve for their dead companions. After waiting for a while, Forza finally became impatient. He looked up at the sky again. At this moment, he suddenly sensed something. He reached out his hand and grabbed his chest. An arrow quietly appeared in front of Forza, and his hand tightly grasped the arrow shaft. His eyes drifted to the left side of the forest. A slender elf was standing outside the gravity enchantment, with a gentle smile on her face. She slowly drew the bow in her hand. Prudence! Forza had realized something. His voice was a little low, and his heart was a little heavy. The next moment, Abdurrah's figure appeared beside Prudence. The elves had extremely sharp eyesight, and Forza's eyesight was not bad either. When Abdurrah and Forza's eyes met, a strange feeling rose in their hearts. Abdurrah had become a one-eyed dragon, and Forza could not open one of his eyes. Of course, the latter was temporary. The two one-eyed dragons looked at each other. The scene was similar to two strange mutes meeting on the street. Only they could understand what kind of feelings they had. Rinnel sat on the ground, unconsciously drawing something with his fingertips. He was not a magician, nor did he understand magic runes. This was just a habit of his. When his emotions fluctuated and he could not control them, he had to do something to divert his attention. A dozen or so orc guards surrounded Lionel. They were vigilantly looking around, but their gazes would often drift back and land on Lionel. They'd been by Lionel's side for many years, but this was the first time they'd seen Lionel so abnormal. This had nothing to do with whether he was calm or not, but rather an indescribable feeling. Only the sharp-eyed and cultured orcs could see that Lionel was constantly writing a single word: Phoebe. On the other side of the hill, there were tens of thousands of Gale Wolf warriors ready to go. Rinnel's ability was not to be underestimated. At least, his ability to command troops was enough to stand alone. Tens of thousands of orcs gathered together, but he could maintain absolute silence. Even the Gale Wolves seemed to be unusually well-behaved. A figure rose abruptly beside Rinnel, and a dozen orc guards immediately grasped the scimitars in their hands. Two of the guards quietly loosened their fingers after seeing the figure clearly. "You're finally here, ha-ha." Rinnel let out a long sigh and threw the branch in his hand far away. He stood up proudly and stared at the figure with a pair of expectant eyes. "Are they reliable?" Han Jin glanced at the orc guards. "They are all warriors who are willing to give up everything for me." "Of course they are reliable." Rinnel seemed to be a little nervous. He had just let out a long sigh, but now he took another long sigh. "And after tonight, even if they are unreliable, it won't change anything, right? You can see through it." Han Jin laughed. "Ha ha ha ha." Han Jin's laughter grew louder and louder, but Rinnel was confused. "What are you laughing at?" "I'm thinking of something in the past." Han Jin laughed. In fact, he was thinking of what had just happened. He and Xavier had cooperated to laugh at Forza's demeanor and gentleness. "Over there." Rinnel wanted to say something, but he didn't. He didn't care about the past. He only cared about what was going on over there. "You can harvest the fruit now," Han Jin said lightly. "On this night of bleeding, the biggest and sweetest fruit." "They." Rinnel couldn't help but lower his voice. "Are Amphila and Prudence here? What about Gaobin? Is he here too?" "What? You want to catch all of them in one fell swoop?" Han Jin said with a faint smile. No, I'm just... Don't forget, my goal is peace." Han Jin said softly. "The coexistence of the three is the most stable. If the elf race is going to be destroyed, I won't cooperate with you. To be honest, although the orcs have never attacked the Holy Crown City, in my heart, you are far more threatening than the elf race." "I know what you mean." Rinnel smiled embarrassedly. Han Jin's words were not pleasant to hear, but the more it was like this, the more he trusted Han Jin. Proper sincerity was true sincerity. If the sincerity was too deep and thick, it would often be full of hypocrisy. "Among the beastmen, I chose you. Among the elves, I chose Gaobin. Rhinelander, you'd better not do anything hostile to him. Otherwise, our peace will become nothing but a bubble." Han Jin said softly, "I have already regarded you as a friend. If you must disappoint me, no, please believe me." Rinnel's face was solemn, and then he hesitated for a moment. Rinnel was not afraid of revealing secrets. As he said, after tonight it would be meaningless, because he had the highest power. But there were some things he could not say. Did he have to ask clearly? If he went there now, would Forza still be alive? "You can take your army there now, but don't get too close. Wait for my signal." Han Jin smiled. "And those dragons belong to me." Of course," Rinnel replied. He was not interested in the dragons, and then he asked in a low voice, "Will you take action?" After all, Prudence was one of the strongest elves, so he was worried about accident. "I will mediate the war between you and the elf race in the future, so I should try my best to avoid staining their blood." Han Jin thought for a moment. "But when necessary, I will take action." "That's good." Rinel was relieved. "Summoning monthly votes, my lords, the situation is too dangerous. If you have votes, please show your support." Last month, I only found out that there was a prize for each category. With everyone's support, I managed to get a bonus, but this month, I was kicked out. What a tragedy! Chapter 402. The elves beside Abdurrah hurriedly helped him up and carefully placed him on the silver Pegasus. Only then did they turn around and jump on their own mounts, fleeing into the forest like a swarm of bees. The gravity enchantment extended to the edge of the forest. Behind them was the forest, which was a blessing in disguise. Prudence pulled the longbow in his hand into a full moon and shot an arrow at Fossa. In fact, Fossa had become silent at this moment. His body was full of arrows, like a giant hedgehog. But Prudence was still worried, so he finally shot another arrow. When the arrow appeared in front of Fossa and shot into his forehead, Prudence shouted, "Let's go!" After saying that, he took the lead in driving the unicorn and retreated in the direction where Ampdol had disappeared. The rest of the elves had long been panicked. When they heard Prudence's order to retreat, they scrambled to follow him into the forest. Prudence had just rushed to the edge of the forest when he saw the elves surrounding Abdurrah rushing out of the forest in a panic. Prudence was shocked. "What's going on?" "Orcs. The forest is full of orcs," Abdurrah screamed. "Quick, let's change direction." Prudence's gaze swept across the forest, and he could faintly see a metallic object reflecting light. His face could not help but reveal a terrified expression. Then, Prudence turned around. Within his field of vision, there were orcs everywhere. They were excitedly waving their scimitars and whistling from all directions. Should I change direction? It would be the same no matter which direction. Moreover, Prudence also had the side effect of overexerting. Since hunting the behemoth, he had been releasing the power of the mark of God. Now, he was exhausted. Furthermore, even if he was at his peak, it would be useless. In this world, there was no one whose combat skills could reach perfection. Every profession had their own weaknesses and strength. The ability to tear space could be used to snipe the enemy's experts or commanders. However, in the face of the tidal wave of Gale Wolf warriors, who would he want to kill? How many could he kill? "Abdurrah, you have to be responsible for today," Prudence roared. "I have already said that this is a trap of the orcs." Now that he had fallen into such a situation, Prudence had no more scruples. He bluntly scolded Ampugula. "A trap of the orcs? What do you know? If this is really a trap of the orcs, how could Fossa?" Abdurrah immediately retorted. But before he could finish his words, he suddenly froze and then screamed. "Wait! Don't do it, I have figured it out! I have figured it out!" Many elves had already drawn their longbows. Since the orcs had surrounded them, they had to fight. Killing one was enough, killing two was killing one. The elves looked at each other in dismay when they heard Ampugula's order to not attack. Although they were still holding their longbows, no one shot an arrow. "What have you figured out?" Prudence was stunned. "This is not a trap. It's an internal strife among the orcs." Abdurrah showed an excited look. "The orcs must have their own internal conflict. Fossa declared war on us, but not all the orcs are willing to do so. Haha! I finally understand why Gaubin dares to guarantee the authenticity of this information with his life." Prudence stared at Abdurrah blankly. His mind was in a mess. He couldn't understand what Abdurrah had understood. "You still don't understand?" Abdurrah's smile was very arrogant. "Simply put, the one who cooperated with Gaubin must be a prince of the orcs with military power. Fossa is dead, so he must be the successor." Gao Bin cooperated with a prince of the orcs? That's impossible, Prudence murmured. Nothing is impossible. Gao Bin's situation has been very difficult, and the Holy Crown City has never sent troops to help him. It is inevitable that he is disappointed, so. Abdurrah stopped talking and didn't continue. He was embarrassed to continue. The Holy Crown City could have been on the same side as the Wild Willow City. The current situation was caused by Abdurrah. How could he blame Gao Bin? What does this have to do with us? Of course it has to do with us. What Gao Bin can give him, I can also give him. What Gao Bin can't give him, I can also give him. Abdurrah said firmly. The surrounding elves were silent. Abdurrah's words sounded like he was trying to flatter the orcs, but no one stood out to blame Abdurrah. But why are they attacking us? Prudence's words made the elves' faint expectations disappear in an instant. Abdurrah was stumped. Did they recognize that we are not Gao Bin? And Pugila began to doubt his own judgment. Battle? Or try to maintain peace? He couldn't decide what to do, but while he was talking, the orcs had already closed in. Seeing that the elves didn't release any arrows, the Gale Wolf warriors felt a little strange. Their charging speed became slower and slower, and finally, they stopped when they were 100 meters away from the elves. This was because Lionel had ordered them to capture the elves alive. Now that they realized that the elves seemed to be collectively surrendering, they had to control their emotions. When Abdurrah saw this, he couldn't help but be surprised. His judgment was not wrong. At this moment, a sorrowful cry came from afar. Father! Father! Fossa's body had been pulled out from the vines by the Gale Wolf warriors. His appearance was miserable. Not to mention his body, there were more than a dozen arrows in his face. One of the arrows was deeply pierced between his eyebrows. Fossa was covered in blood from head to toe. Even the vines that were wrapped around him were dyed red. Maybe it was because Rinnel's cry was too sad, but when Rinnel came to Forsa's side, Forsa suddenly opened his eyes. More than a dozen guards had already surrounded Reiner and Forsa. Seeing this scene, they were also frightened and consciously turned their eyes away. They didn't dare to look at it anymore. You! The muscles on Forsa's face twitched uncontrollably. His body was full of arrows. Although Ryan's fall was not a big deal, his body, which was as strong as Forsa's, knocked away the arrows and even pierced a few more inches into his body. Father! Seeing that Forsa had woken up, Lionel was overjoyed. Then he suddenly stretched out his hand and impolitely covered Forsa's mouth. His other hand grabbed the arrow in the middle of Forsa's eyebrows and pulled it out with a sudden force. Blood splashed, and Forsa let out a muffled scream. His body straightened like a spring, and he grabbed Rinnel's robe with both hands. Even his severely injured eye was wide open, glaring at Rinnel. But soon he couldn't see anything. The blood gushing from his forehead covered his eyes like a heavy blood curtain. Rinnel opened his arms and slowly hugged Forsa in his arms. The force he released was so great that it broke all the arrows on Forsa's body, making a series of cracking sounds. Then he said word by word in Forsa's ear, "Old man, this time, you can't take my Phoebe, can you? You!" Forsa tried his best, but he could only spit out a single word. He was seriously injured and he was almost dying. Moreover, he had been tortured by Rhine twice. He was very strong that he didn't faint on the spot. There was some understanding, some anger, and some regret in his eyes. But no one knew what Forsa was regretting. Was it because he shouldn't have treated his son like this, or was he regretting that he didn't get rid of this unfilial son earlier? Rinnel turned his head and looked at Forsa. He wanted to know what kind of expression this old man would have after knowing his true thoughts. Forsa also tried hard to look at Rinnel. The eyes of the father and son collided heavily. Rinnel's eyes were clear and full of smiles, while Forsa's eyes were cloudy and full of anger. However, their expressions were equally ferocious. "Goodbye, old man, haha." Rinnel lowered his voice. The blue veins on his hands stood out, and his arms slowly tightened. Force's eyeballs bulged at the same time. Blood flowed out of his mouth, nostrils, and the corners of his eyes. The guards around could even clearly hear the sound of bones breaking. Rinnel remained in this position for a few minutes. When his arms were slightly trembling, he put Forza down little by little. This time, Forza was completely dead. His lifeless eyes stared blankly at the night sky. His mouth was wide open, and his protruding fangs had become dim. "Father!" Rinnel cried out sadly and wiped Forza's eyes with his hand. But Forza's muscles had begun to stiffen. When Rinnel wiped his hand, Forza's eyes closed. But when Rinnel raised his hand, Forza's eyes opened a little bit. A trace of anger flashed across Rinnel's face. He hated Forza's eyes. His hatred had finally been vented. He should have been happy, but there was a kind of panic in his heart. He didn't dare to look at Forza's eyes. Just as Rinnel was about to do something, an orc's voice suddenly came from outside. "General! What's the matter?" Rinnel suddenly raised his head and asked angrily. "Those elves seem to be surrendering." Rinnel glanced coldly at Forza's body, then stood up and winked at the guards. He then jumped on his mount and rushed to the surrounded elves in the distance. "Rinnel, it's you?" Seeing Rinnel, Ampugula was very surprised. Then, Ampugula and Prudence quickly looked at each other. The former was, of course, very proud, while the latter showed admiration. Ampugula's judgment had been proved. Rinnel was the eldest son of Forza, and he had joined the army early on. He held the military power. If something happened to Forza, Rinnel was almost the only successor. The other princes wanted to compete with Rinnel, but they couldn't compete with Rinnel. "It's nice to see you, Lord Ampugula," Rinnel said lightly. Ampugula was stunned. He had been paying attention to Rinnel. It was reasonable to say that Gaubin was cooperating with Rinnel, so when Rinnel found that Gaubin didn't appear and the ones who killed Forza were Ampugula and Prudence, he should be very surprised. However, Rinnel looked very calm, as if he had already known that it was them. There must be something wrong. Ampugula frowned and thought hard. He had always thought that he was intelligent, but at this moment, his mind was in a mess. He couldn't think of a suitable reason. "It's nice to see you too." Ampugula forced a smile. Rinnel's eyes swept over Ampugula and Prudence, then swept over the elves who were ready for battle. In fact, at this moment, the battle formation had lost most of its meaning. The Gale Wolf warriors had formed a circle more than 100 meters away from the elves. As long as Rinnel gave the order, they could crash into the elves' battle formation in a few seconds and engage in close combat with the elves. "Put down your weapons." "I don't want to embarrass you," Rinnel said softly. "Are you kidding me? You want us to put down our weapons?" Prudence said angrily. "Prudence, you'd better think carefully. If I really wanted to kill you, you would have been chopped into pieces." Rinnel smiled. "Listening to me will only be good for you. Frankly speaking, peace will come soon. The question is, can you live until that day?" "Prudence, don't be impulsive." Ampugula hurriedly stopped Prudence, then his eyes fell on Rinnel. "You said that peace will come soon?" "Yes," Rinnel said slowly. "Do you think I need to lie now?" Ampugula took a deep breath, turned around and ordered, "Put down your weapons." Most of the elves didn't throw away their longbows as Ampugula ordered. Instead, their eyes fell on Prudence. They came from the Southern Forest Army and were Prudence's personal guards. In the face of a matter of life and death, of course, they would only obey Prudence's orders. "Elder Ampugula?" Prudence said anxiously. He wasn't used to surrendering to anyone, nor was he used to putting down his weapons. Moreover, Rinnel didn't express the kindness they had imagined. Instead, he acted in a condescending manner, which made him feel uneasy. With a longbow in hand, he could at least make the enemy pay a corresponding price. Did he have to be at the mercy of others? "Prudence, didn't you hear me?" Ampugula was also angry. Rinnel calmly watched the two elven leaders arguing there. He didn't know that Ampugula was deliberately trying to curry favor with him. In fact, he was thinking about how to curry favor with Han Jin. Prudence and Dragon City Elder Maxwell conspired together and almost killed Han Jin. The hatred in Han Jin's heart could be seen from the fact that he plotted to kill more than 20 Dragon City dragons. Rinal knew that Han Jin also hated Prudence and Ampugula. He would first capture these two guys alive, let them taste some punishment, and then execute them. That way, the credit would still be his. It would be considered as revenge for his father, and Han Jin would be satisfied. Prudence's eyes flickered, but his fingers clenched tighter and tighter. The uneasiness in his heart couldn't be eliminated, so he didn't want to put down his weapon. I have to hurry back to the palace as soon as possible. I don't have time to dawdle with you. Rinal waved his hand and the Gale Wolf warriors rushed out of the forest to the left and right, making a path. Those who put down their weapons can leave. Among the elves, some were Ampugula's guards. They had already thrown away their longbows according to Ampugula's order. Hearing Rinal's words, they tentatively drove their silver Pegasi into the forest bit by bit. Sure enough, the Gale Wolf warriors didn't stop them and let them go into the depths of the forest. Although Abdurrah had already made his decision, his heart was still unsettled. Seeing this scene, he could finally heave a sigh of relief. He glared hatefully at Prudence and turned around to leave. But after taking a few steps, he felt that something was wrong. Among the elves, Gaobin had already grasped almost all of the military power. The only one who was willing to cooperate with him was Prudence. He couldn't just leave Prudence here. You still don't understand? Ampugula patiently said to Prudence in a low voice. Gaobin has already reached a peace agreement with Rhinelander. Rinal did this just to show his stance. He is as tough as his father, Forza. After all, it was Forza who started the war first and killed countless elves. Rinal is also worried that we will retaliate. He is warning us that if we force him, he will start a second war at all costs. Alas, you don't understand this kind of thing. Just do as I say. Prudence looked at Ampugula's single eye, and suddenly he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. At the Elven Assembly, Ampugula had dug out one of his own eyes and said that he would use his remaining eye to see the destruction of the orcs. Was this Ampugula really the same person? Were those bloody oaths all bullshit? Prudence didn't know Ampugula well. He was as fierce as a lion and as timid as a rabbit. These two completely different qualities could sometimes be fully reflected in the same person. Ampugula swore that he would never coexist with the orcs, but when it really came down to it, the other elves would risk their lives and sacrifice themselves. As long as they had a bit of fighting power left, the elves would never let their elders go to the battlefield. Just like when Ampugula suddenly attacked Han Jin and forced Sunir to marry Prudence, it was always others who had to suffer and pay the price. But now, Ampugula was also surrounded. If a conflict really happened, he would also be unlucky. So, he would find countless reasons for peace. He would rather lie to others, lie to his companions, and even lie to himself to hold on to that sense of security. He didn't care whether the safety in his hands was reliable or not. Prudence couldn't make a decision. His eyes turned back and forth, and finally fell on Rinal. If he desperately released all his power, he should be able to kill Rinal. Rinal was still so calm, as if he couldn't see the hatred in Prudence's eyes. He was just quietly waiting for Prudence's decision. Prudence! Ampugula was already a little flustered. At this moment, a signal that only the elves could send out came from the depths of the forest. They were safe. Prudence's fingertips loosened a little. It seemed that Rinal really didn't have any bad intentions. Chapter 403. Yelena stood in the corridor and carefully looked around, then quickly ran into the wall. The next moment, her figure had disappeared without a trace. On the other side of the wall was Han Jin's magic laboratory. Within half an hour, this was the 5th time Yelena had broken in. She had to find Han Jin because something big had happened. This time, Yelena didn't miss him. Han Jin stood in the endless starry sky, lost in thought. Raphael, why did you come back so late? Yelena said anxiously. Something happened. Something big happened. What happened? Han Jin asked naturally, but his tone was full of absent-mindedness. The Vatican was attacked. It was done by the dragons of the Dragon Realm. The holy crystals were stolen by those dragons. Yelena became more and more agitated as she spoke. Jedis is going crazy. I've known him for so long, but I didn't expect his face to become so terrible. Guevara brought the Night Order and Jedis back to the Holy Crown City, and Yelena still had a lot to say, but after Han Jin made a move, she was immediately stunned. She stared at the huge, shining crystal in the middle of the room, almost unable to believe her eyes. What is that? What is that? Yelena swallowed her saliva with great difficulty. She stretched out her finger toward the crystal, but quickly retracted her finger as if she had been electrocuted. Raphael, she stammered. I've been waiting for this day for a long time. Han Jin didn't answer her question and sighed. His sigh was mixed with many complicated emotions. Raphael. Yelena couldn't control herself anymore. She rushed forward and grabbed Han Jin's arm tightly. You and the Dragon Realm join forces. No, why would I join forces with the Dragon Realm? Han Jin smiled. I understand. Yelena let out a long sigh of relief. She even felt like she was about to collapse. It turned out that it was just a misunderstanding. You found the giant dragons of the Dragon Realm and then took the holy crystal back from them, right? No, they took the initiative to give me Saint Crystals. How is this possible? Yelena was once again dumbfounded. She couldn't figure it out. Long you had suddenly attacked the Holy See, snatched the Saint Crystal, and then gave it to Han Jin. Wasn't there something wrong with this? After a while, Yelena asked with difficulty, Why? Because I was the one who told them to go. Upon hearing this, Yelena could no longer think. She could only shake her head vigorously as if she wanted to throw Han Jin's words out of her mind. No, definitely not. Don't joke around. Be good, don't talk for now. Give me some time. Han Jin reached out and held Yelena's face, then bent down and kissed her gently on the lips. I'll give you a reasonable explanation later, okay? You know, I've been setting up a magic array in the magic lab for the past few days. It's all for this. Yelena stared blankly at Han Jin. After a while, she nodded and obediently stepped aside. At this moment, Yelena's heart was in turmoil. She couldn't believe that Han Jin would do such a thing. She desperately hoped that Han Jin could give her an explanation immediately, but Han Jin's expression was very serious. Without knowing what Han Jin was doing, she could only choose to give in. Han Jin narrowed his eyes slightly and took a long breath. This proved that Han Jin was also very excited. Universe of stars, Han Jin suddenly said. As he formed a spell, the starlight around him, above him, and under his feet began to tremble. Complete universe. Han Jin's shout was as loud as thunder. In Yelena's eyes, Han Jin suddenly turned into a strange man with thousands of arms. Almost at every moment, Han Jin would form a dozen different spells. Around Han Jin, thousands of talismans were emitting a dazzling light. The light was particularly dazzling, far brighter than the scorching sun at noon. Yelena didn't dare to release magic to protect herself so as to avoid elemental conflict. She could only close her eyes and observe the situation outside. The huge, shining crystal seemed to be supported by an invisible force. It slowly rose into the air and began to rotate with itself as the center. Yelena suddenly realized that the whole room had turned into a giant vortex. Everything, including Han Jin's spells, the strangely shaped runes, and the dim starlight around them, were all swirling toward the holy crystal. Perhaps it was because the surroundings were spinning too fast, but Yelena felt dizzy and couldn't help but take a few steps back until she leaned against the wall. Only then did she feel more comfortable. Han Jin had exerted all his strength and kept running the incantation. In the beginning, he was still the one who had to drive the big matrix, but now the vortex was automatically absorbing the vital energy in his body, which made him feel weak. Fortunately, he had made sufficient preparations in advance, otherwise, he would have ended up just like the shaman who had released the great gravity art. Yelena had already closed her eyes and was waiting silently. After an unknown amount of time, she felt the light in front of her fading quickly. She carefully opened her eyes and suddenly realized that the room had turned into a strange darkness. All the starlight and runes had completely disappeared. Her surroundings were so deep that she couldn't see anything, but she could see Han Jin. Han Jin was sweating so much that his hair was stuck to his forehead. He looked very embarrassed. Moreover, Han Jin's face was pale and his body was trembling slightly, as if he couldn't hold on any longer. Even more strange was the holy crystal. At this moment, the holy crystal had shrunk to the size of a disc. Its luster was much dimmer, and it was still spinning and shrinking. Yelena still didn't dare to open her mouth and disturb Han Jin. She carefully observed the holy crystal. The holy crystal slowly turned into a pearl, but it was still shrinking. After a moment, the holy crystal shrank into a small star, flashed, and finally disappeared. When the star disappeared, Yelena's eyes lost all their functions. She could no longer see Han Jin or herself. The heavy darkness made it difficult for her to breathe. Then, a little light bloomed in the place where the holy crystal had disappeared, driving away all the darkness in an instant. Yelena immediately closed her eyes as a conditioned reflex. Thank goodness, thank goodness. Han Jin's voice sounded, but his voice sounded very weak. When Yelena opened her eyes again, she found that everything had returned to normal. The Saint Crystal was still huge, and it was still spinning slowly. The surrounding starlight was still twinkling, as if what had just happened was just an illusion. Raphael. Yelena rushed forward a few steps, held Han Jin's arm and asked with a smile, "Your magic array succeeded?" "Yes." Han Jin's face was full of smiles. Yelena couldn't smile, nor did she have anything to say. It was obvious that Han Jin's magic array had borrowed the power of the holy crystal. One side was personal feelings, and the other side was justice. This made Yelena feel very conflicted and painful. "Let me sit for a while," Han Jin whispered. Yelena helped Han Jin sit on the floor little by little. She watched as Han Jin closed his eyes and entered meditation. Her expression was a little blank. "What should I do? Help Jedis? That's definitely not possible. Han Jin will be angry. Helping Han Jin. Wouldn't they be letting Jedis down?" Everyone had seen what Jedis had done. Treating Jedis this way was really... "Yelena, what are you thinking about?" Han Jin's voice startled Yelena. She replied in a panic, "Nothing, nothing." Han Jin had only adjusted his breathing for a moment. He couldn't just sit here and wait for his vital energy to recover. Besides, Jedis and Guevara should have found the dragon corpses by now. The effect of absorbing dragon blood was far better than meditating here. Cain was also there, so he should know how to deal with the dragons. Han Jin found that Yelena had been deliberately avoiding his gaze, and he knew why. He smiled, and his eyes fell on the holy crystal. He lowered his head and pondered. "Raphael, what are you thinking about?" Yelena whispered. "I'm thinking about how to explain it to Jedis in the future," Han Jin replied with a smile. "No. Please don't." Yelena immediately turned pale with fright. "He will fight you to the death." "Not necessarily. You didn't see what Jedis looked like at that time." Yelena still had lingering fears when she talked about Jedi's reaction. "Yelena, do you know what I'm most afraid of?" Han Jin asked slowly. "What are you most afraid of?" "A knot in your heart." "A knot in your heart?" Yelena couldn't figure it out. What was there to be afraid of? "Yes, so I will explain it to him sooner or later, and..." Han Jin couldn't help but think of Sunir at this moment, but he couldn't mention that name in front of Yelena. He will never forgive you. Yelena was really anxious. She was just thinking about whether she should say a few words for Jedis, but now she had completely forgotten about it. Han Jin's decision was very stupid. She only wanted to try her best to maintain the unity and stability of the group. Raphael, don't do anything stupid. Jedis will definitely fight you to the death. I just said, not necessarily. Han Jin took out a magic crystal as he spoke. It was a trophy from a year ago when they hunted a large group of thunderbirds. Then, Han Jin placed the magic crystal on the floor and formed a spell. Yelena saw traces of visible electric arcs floating out of the magic crystal and wandering around the room. This is... Yelena sensed a fluctuation of electric element. You sensed it? Han Jin smiled and took out a few more Thunderbird magic crystals and placed them on the floor. A layer of fog-like things floated above the magic crystals, but they were actually very small electric arcs. As time passed, the magic crystals quickly dimmed and finally turned into pure crystals. Han Jin and Yelena also changed at the same time. Their clothes and hair seemed to be attracted by an invisible force and kept floating and dancing. What a pure elemental tide! Yelena exclaimed. Yelena, if you meditated here every day, wouldn't the effect be surprisingly good? Han Jin smiled. At first, Yelena didn't realize what such pure elements meant to her. When she heard Han Jin's words, she was stunned. Then, she jumped up and screamed, Meditate here? Of course. Han Jin said slowly, I spent so much effort to let me, you, and everyone else improve our strength quickly. Han Jin had set up a spirit gathering array. He had this idea for a long time. Unfortunately, suitable treasures were too difficult to find. As the center of a spirit gathering array, the requirements were very strict. Han Jin had lived here for more than 3 years and still hadn't found a suitable treasure. In fact, if there were other choices, Han Jin would never have thought about the Holy Sea. The composition of magic crystals was somewhat special. In addition to providing energy, they also contained pure element. Han Jin wasn't very interested in elements because he had passed the stage of relying on the power of amplification spells to protect himself. In the end, energy was everything to him. However, elements shouldn't be wasted. Last time when he went to hunt the Thunderbird, Yelena insisted on meditating in Thunder Valley, saying that the Thunder Valley was rich in elements. From then on, he had this idea in his heart. The energy belonged to himself, and the elements belonged to his friends. Everyone would benefit. After so long, his idea had finally come true, so Han Jin was excited. In contrast, after defeating Zagund, Dismark, and the others, he had always been calm. The latter belonged to the secular world, while the former meant that he had passed a hurdle and solved a big problem. He had accumulated a lot of dragon crystals. At first, he was very disappointed because even if the base point was raised, he couldn't absorb the energy of the dragon crystals. Now, he could use the spirit gathering array to slowly extract the energy of the dragon crystals. This kind of success couldn't be compared to a few victories. Oh my God! Oh my God! Yelena had fallen into a daze. She finally understood how the magic array set up by Han Jin had subverted the current magic system of the continent. Her father, Grand Duke Solomon, opened the Magic Academy and personally taught the students. This kind of personal practice promoted the development of magic, causing the elemental capital to give birth to many outstanding magicians. She once thought that her father had made a great contribution to the magic civilization of mankind, and the influence that this magic array in front of her would have on the magic civilization could be described as incomparable. The elements in the room were thousands of times richer than outside. After all, the room was not very big. Han Jin had extracted the energy of a few 9th-grade magic crystals. Yelena was very clear that meditating here for a day was equivalent to meditating for dozens of days outside. What did this mean? It would increase the lifespan of humans by dozens of times. If this magic array was popularized, one day, humans would have the power to face the gods and even defeat them. I know Jed's is angry, but if I told him that I could make the Holy See have more than a dozen cardinals and a few holy knights in a few years, Han Jin said softly, would he still be angry? Yelena didn't hear what Han Jin was saying. Her big eyes seemed to be staring at Han Jin, but also seemed to be looking through Han Jin's body into the starry sky. Yelena. Seeing that Yelena didn't answer, Han Jin had to raise his voice. What? Yelena asked blankly. Han Jin smiled and shook his head, then changed the topic. The elements can't be mixed up. The elements extracted from the magic crystals are too thick. When multiple elements are mixed together, unexpected things may happen. So, for the time being, let's use the magic crystals of the Thunderbird. If Guevara also practiced here, would he benefit like you? Yes. Yelena nodded vigorously. Guevara practices the lightning fighting technique. Yes, there's also the little guy. If it can stay here for a few days, its power will become even stronger. I can only consider you guys first. Han Jin pondered. Then we have to consider the fire element. Kane, Winston, and Saxon all need to practice in the fire element. Also, will the immortal bird that you signed a contract with wake up faster? Yes. Yelena nodded even harder. After the immortal bird went through nirvana, it would take a few years or even a dozen years to wake up. With the help of the magic array, it might be able to wake up in a few months. This made her very happy. Morrison's and Gibran. Han Jin seemed to be a little hesitant. I'll talk to them in detail first. However, the influence of elements on warriors is not very big, at least not compared to mages, Yelena said. The galaxy fighting technique that Morrison's mastered is the only one of the 5 major fighting techniques that doesn't rely on the power of element. I feel that it won't have much effect on him. Gibran should be similar to Morrison's. This is a little unfair to them. Han Jin frowned. And Sessa. After becoming a warlock, he should have chosen his future direction long ago, but he hasn't made a decision yet. Why hasn't he made a decision yet? Yelena said. I've talked to him. He wants to specialize in earth magic. Earth magic? Why earth magic? Han Jin was stunned. Among the various top magic crystals, earth magic crystals were the least valuable. This also proved the importance of earth magic, so Han Jin felt very strange. Kane and Lorraine majored in fire magic, Leslie in water magic, and I'm a magus of air magic. So Sasu can only practice earth magic. Yelena majored in electricity magic, but electricity magic was a branch of air magic. Because of its fierce and swift attack power, it shone brilliantly and could almost be considered an independent magic. However, on the magic badge, water, fire, earth, and air magic were still the 4 major categories. Well, they're back. Let's go out and take a look. Han Jin suddenly stood up. He had been worried about the bodies of the dragons, but he couldn't do anything about it. Because of various restrictions, he could only meet with the dragons in the area near the Holy Crown City. It was not difficult for Jedis to find the battlefield. If he found that a few dragons had their blood sucked, what would happen? Therefore, he could only put his hope on Kane, hoping that Kane could make the necessary preparations in time. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 404. Raphael, do you know what we found? As soon as he saw Han Jin's figure, Kane could not help but shout. Jedis was not here, otherwise, he would not have shouted in such a tone, which would have irritated Jedis. What did you find? Han Jin asked, even though he already knew the answer. Dragons. More than 20 dragons. Kane's eyes and face were full of joy. Secrets were easy to leak, not to mention that in the later stages, Han Jin no longer cared about protecting the secret, nor could he protect it. For example, when Fabian was in charge of absorbing the dragon's blood, it was impossible for him to do everything by himself. He needed some helpers, some mages and alchemists to ensure the quality of the dragon's blood, and some soldiers to escort it. Therefore, many people knew that Han Jin's ability to improve so quickly must have something to do with the dragon's blood. In fact, they had secretly learned about it. Morrisons and a few others once secretly found Fabian and asked for a bottle of dragon's blood. They shared it and drank it, but they did not feel any effect, so they had to give up in the end. In terms of affiliation, they were all members of the Holy Crown City Force Group. The stronger Han Jin was, the safer they would be, and the brighter their future would be. In terms of personal relationships, Cain, Gibran, and Julia had exchanged their lives for each other, and they were also the first mercenary team to contact Han Jin and the others. After many battles, they had formed a deep friendship. Of course, Cain hoped to see Han Jin improve further. Therefore, Cain was so excited that he almost could not control himself. More than 20 dragons? Really? Han Jin said in surprise. As soon as he said that, Han Jin knew that something was wrong. His reaction was a little pretentious. In fact, it was not that he did not know how to act. The problem was that if he was deceiving his enemies, he would definitely do it perfectly. But if he deliberately deceived his friends, it was a different matter. He could not cross the hurdle in his heart, and there were some flaws in his acting. It's true. Haha, are you surprised? Cain laughed. Guevara's eyes flashed, but he quickly shifted his gaze elsewhere as if nothing had happened. Cain would not pay attention to such details, nor would he suspect Han Jin. However, Guevara's observation skills were much sharper than Cain's. This was normal. Guevara's experience was enough to make a legend, but it was filled with tragedy. Cain's experience was considered rich among his peers, but compared to Guevara's, the difference was too great. Han Jin knew something was wrong and hurriedly changed the topic. Where's Jed's? If he hadn't seen Jedis leave, he wouldn't have come out to greet him. If he hadn't seen Jedis leave, he wouldn't have come out to greet him. Even in front of Cain, he would have exposed his flaws. If he faced Jedis directly, perhaps his flaws would be even bigger and more obvious. Moreover, a long time ago, when he had a heart-to-heart talk with Jedis, he had said, "If you don't lie to me, I will never lie to you." If he wanted to ask for Jedis' forgiveness in the future, he would have to avoid contact with Jedis now. Otherwise, it would be difficult for him to gain trust. He took a few Knight of Light back to the Holy Crown City. Adonis is seriously injured, and Aud is still unconscious. The Vatican needs someone to take charge. Cain replied. Han Jin sighed softly and his eyes fell on Ai Mijia. Ai Mijia had also left with his knight regiment. Moreover, Jedis had asked Ai Mijia to stay with the Knights of Light at this time, which meant that he wanted to help Han Jin and contribute in this war. However, this made Han Jin feel even more uncomfortable. He walked over and patted Ai Mijia on the shoulder. "I've heard from Yelena, we." After saying this sentence, Han Jin didn't know how to continue. Ai Mijia was a young general that he valued more, and he also had the opportunity to enter the magic laboratory to train. As for a lie, it was better not to say it so easily. "Sir, I understand. Don't worry about me." Ai Mijia's eyes were full of anger, but his tone was still very gentle. Even if this didn't happen, the Vatican would still not forgive the sins of the Dragon Field. "But the last time I saw Chazos here, I didn't do anything to make you worry, did I? The Vatican and the Dragon Field? What happened between you two?" Cain asked in surprise. When Nicholas attacked the Mountains of the Rising Sun, the dragons of the Dragon Field were their main force. Ai Mijia said lightly. "It's good that you can stay rational." Han Jin said slowly. "Hatred is used to destroy the enemy. If the first one to be destroyed is yourself, it's better to choose to forget." Han Jin could only persuade AI Mijia with this irrelevant truth. I will always remember your teachings in my heart. Amijie bowed slightly and said respectfully. Although AI Mijia looked a little older than Han Jin, and his tone was a little strange, everyone thought it was normal. AI Mijia was a paladin knight who could stay rational, and Han Jin valued him because of this. When he ran into the guardian of the dragon field, Shazos, he acted as if nothing had happened. After returning, he did not leak any information. He had a quality that most young people lacked: calmness. If it were odd, no one could guarantee that he would cause trouble. Even if he knew that he was no match for Shazos, he could still challenge him on the spot, or use harsh diplomatic words to force Han Jin. AI Mijia was very clear that Han Jin could kill Maxwell, but it did not mean that Han Jin could fight against the Dragon City, let alone make enemies with the Dragon Field and the Dragon City at the same time. That would be suicide. Dismark had been operating in the Holy Crown City for many years, turning the city into a fortress with strong defense. However, compared with the never-setting sun mountains where the Vatican was located, it was nothing. If Dismark was like an iron tortoise, then the Vatican, which had been entrenched in the never-setting sun mountains for countless years, was like a golden tortoise. But what about a golden tortoise? Nicholas and the Dragon Field joined hands to attack and destroyed all the defenses of the Vatican. It only took a few days for the Vatican to fall. Now, the Vatican had become extremely weak after surviving the disaster, and it was not suitable for them to challenge the Dragon Field, even if Han Jin helped them with all his strength. If they really angered the Dragon Field only needed to send out hundreds of giant dragons to turn the Vatican and the Holy Crown City into the dust of history. In fact, after Shazos learned that Han Jin had made enemies with the Dragon City, he still went to Depew City and Cold Shadow City according to the original plan, and then went back to the capital of elements to find Grand Duke Solomon. Finally, he decided to come to the Holy Crown City. The existence of the Vatican had a great influence. Han Jin had made enemies with the Dragon City, which was his advantage, but he had a close relationship with the Vatican, which was his disadvantage. The two sides offset each other, and Shazos's impression of him became worse. If he did not realize that Han Jin had unimaginable potential, he would not have come to the Holy Crown City at all. Suddenly, there was a burst of cheers below the God of War. People walked to the side of the ship and looked down. About 40 horses were pulling a giant dragon as big as a hill, and they were slowly approaching the camp. According to the weight of the giant dragon, not to mention 40 horses, even 400 horses might not be able to pull it. However, there were not only a few people around Han Jin, but also thousands of people. As the saying goes, there is strength in numbers. This strength was in a broad sense, not just the strength of people. Cain was the actual commander of the Magic Legion in the Holy Crown City, and he had many water magicians under his command. The magicians took turns to form a thick layer of ice on the ground. Wherever the horse pulled the dragon, the ice would be there. Of course, it was much easier than pulling a heavy object on the ground. If they could put the giant dragon in a space ring, it would be even easier. Unfortunately, such a great artifact had never appeared on the continent. "Let's go, Yelena, let's go down and have a look," Han Jin said to Yelena. "I have already informed Fabian. Anyway, he has experience in this field." Cain felt a little surprised. Why should they go down? If they waited here, someone would deliver the dragon's blood. Han Jin ignored Cain and released the earth-shrinking spell. Yelena also floated in the air, left the God of War, and chased after Han Jin's back. When Han Jin and Yelena landed near the giant dragon, Fabian had already started to work with his manufacturing team. Seeing Han Jin, the nearby soldiers paused for a moment, and then burst into cheers. The cheers became louder and louder, reaching a deafening level. Wholeheartedly obeying the strong, even cheering for the strong's progress, grieving for the strong's setbacks, and even forgetting their own existence. This was a kind of slavery engraved deep in the soul. It was a pity that in this chaotic continent, slavery was the only survival strategy for most ordinary people. Otherwise, they would easily lose their right to live. Sometimes, even if the slavery was deep enough, it was still easy to be killed, just like in Radon Town, where Han Jin lived. Everyone would encounter many firsts, and the enlightenment of the first time could often change one's goal, worldview, and so on. Han Jin's present situation was inseparable from his first experience. Radon Town was burned down, and the mayor of Radon Town, Manhana, was hacked to death in public. Human life was so cheap. For a period of time, Han Jin hated Manhana very much, because Manhana deliberately made things difficult for Raphael. Because of Manhana's example, other townspeople dared to vent their dissatisfaction with the nobles on the two degraded master and servant. Now that he thought about it, although Manhana was bad, he was honest. At least, he did not secretly send people to kill Raphael. However, some other higher-ranked people killed Manhana on the spot as if they were crushing an ant. There was no need to blame the slavery of ordinary people. The so-called survival strategy meant that without slavery, they would have died long ago. Slavery was born in a high-pressure and chaotic environment from the beginning to the end. In fact, not only ordinary people always felt suffocating pressure, but also those powerful people, because there was always someone stronger than them. This world was a chaotic one full of pressure for survival. Most of the high-ranking people ruled the territory by means of iron and blood, except for Han Jin. When they first met the Red Vanguards, Gibran, Cain, Julia, and the others were all quite strong. If they joined a lord, they would definitely be put in an important position. However, many high-ranking mercenaries chose to stay in isolated Cliff City for no other reason than the difference in the nature of the pressure to survive. The pressure to survive in isolated Cliff City was simple and straightforward, while the pressure to survive in a lord's territory was complex and heavy. To put it bluntly, in isolated Cliff City, their life and death were in their own hand. At worst, they could control their greed and not take on dangerous missions. However, if they joined another lord, they would gain considerable power and influence, but their life and death would not be in their own hands. If their strength improved too quickly, they could become a threat to the lord. If their strength improved too slowly, they would be ignored. Even if they did everything perfectly, who could guarantee that they would not become a pawn of the lord? But by Han Jin's side, no one could feel the pressure from Han Jin. It was proven that Han Jin never let his friends sacrifice themselves. On the contrary, he always took the dangerous burden on himself. So Gibran, Cain, and Julia came. So Winston and Saxon came. Dwight Steele of the Dragon Singer mercenary group also wanted to come. But Han Jin felt that the Dragon Singer mercenary group's departure left the strength of isolated Cliff City too weak, so he asked Dwight Steele to stay in isolated Cliff City for a while. There were also many others. Guevara came, Jedis and Dominique stayed, Hogan changed from betrayal to loyalty, Alexander, Majordomo Gale, and so on. It could be said that when Grand Duke Solomon was as young as Han Jin, he would never have been as outstanding as Han Jin. However, Han Jin, who was focused on cultivation, didn't realize why all the strong people he came into contact with were willing to stay on the god of war and by his side. Sometimes, Han Jin's thinking was very simple. Of course, he wouldn't easily trust anyone. He would slowly think about it, and when he thought that this person was really good to everyone, he would accept them, truly accept them. As for protecting them, that was just his duty. He never thought that there was anything to be proud of. Fabian heard the cheers of the soldiers and turned his head to see Han Jin. He hurriedly came over with a smile. "Go do your work." Han Jin smiled and waved his hand. "Sir, Miss Yelena, Sir Guevara, I'll be going then." Fabian bowed and ran back. He finally understood Han Jin's preference. Instead of saying 1,000 words of flattery, it was better to do one thing well. Han Jin didn't even care about other people's attitude. He only cared about his or her actions. When Han Jin heard the words, Sir Guevara, he couldn't help but be stunned. He pulled Yelena and ran down to avoid Guevara. He could feel that Guevara was suspicious. Turning around, he saw Guevara striding over. Han Jin sighed in his heart. He gently put his hand on Yelena and put on a very affectionate posture. He then asked, "Why are you here?" Han Jin's subtext was very obvious. "Look, I'm being intimate with Yelena. Don't disturb us, okay? Don't you think you should explain to me?" Guevara said faintly, as if he didn't see anything. "Explain what?" Han Jin weighed in his heart. Anyway, this sentence wasn't a lie. He was just pretending to be stupid. The battlefield is in chaos. There are giant dragons from Dragon City, giant dragons from Dragon City, giant dragons from Dragon's Realm, and also orcs and behemoth. Even the dead bodies of elves have appeared. How could they be together? Guevara said slowly, "This is ridiculous. At first, I couldn't understand it, but then, I remembered that you had been practicing in isolation for a few days. Yesterday, after dinner, you disappeared without a trace. I think you should give me an explanation. Almost all the forces are involved in the battle. I don't believe that you're not involved." This. Han Jin hesitated. Yelena gently touched Han Jin's waist. She felt that she would have to tell Guevara sooner or later, so she might as well tell him now. Guevara's observation was so sharp that he immediately caught this movement. Thinking about it, with Yelena's curiosity, she should also be curious about this topic. At this moment, he didn't see any desire to ask. He immediately made a judgment in his heart and said, "You don't want to tell me? Okay, Yelena, come with me." Okay. Yelena answered obediently. She knew the relationship between Han Jin and Guevara. These two people were no longer friends, but elders and juniors who were related by blood. In the future, when she and Han Jin held their wedding, Guevara would be the only person qualified to host it. In other words, she was half a daughter-in-law to Guevara. Of course, she had to listen to him. Han Jin couldn't help but smile bitterly. With Yelena's scheming, she would probably tell him everything in a few words. He hesitated for a moment and sighed. "Yelena, bring Mr. Guevara to my magic laboratory." "You have a magic laboratory? Where is it?" Guevara was stunned. "It's on the God of War. Come with me," Yelena said with a smile. "You're not going?" Guevara asked. "Yelena can give you an explanation." Han Jin was a little helpless. What he said to Yelena was the truth. Although he had schemed against Jed's Vatican for various benefits, he couldn't help but feel guilty. It would be too embarrassing for him to explain how he schemed against Jed's, so he might as well let Yelena do it. "Wait for me here. Don't leave," Guevara said. "Understood." Han Jin shrugged his shoulders. If an outsider were to overhear their conversation, they would never believe that Han Jin was the real Lord. In fact, as Han Jin's strength grew, Guevara's role in the Lord's mansion had gradually decreased. However, the relationship between the two of them was not based on their strength. Perhaps this was what attracted Guevara the most. He could find a feeling here, as if he was facing a younger generation who needed guidance and help. If Guevara didn't let him leave, then he really couldn't leave. He didn't want to anger Guevara. Although Guevara's body had been taken care of, it was still not very good. One day, when he really reached the peak, he hoped that this old man could live until that day and cheer for him. Kane's mages were already dispersing the surrounding soldiers, while Fabian was thawing the giant dragon. Because the effect of the dragon's blood evaporated quickly, they had to finish the work as soon as possible. Not long after, Guevara and Yelena hurried over. At this moment, Guevara's face was very strange. His white beard was fluttering even though there was no wind, and his eyes were shining brightly. When he saw Han Jin, he couldn't wait to ask, "Tell me, what did you get?" "A lot," Get to the point. Ha ha! Han Jin laughed. I won't talk about the magic laboratory. I won the trust of the Dragon Realm and Dragon City. Forza is dead, and the orcs lost more than 20 behemoths. Their strength has been greatly reduced. Amjala and Prudence are also dying. Gaobin can completely control the elves. I believe that in the future, the elves will be our trustworthy comrades. Is this enough? Guevara was silent for a long time and let out a long sigh. Chapter 405. The name Raphael had become a curse. Even Forza would have a headache if he was an enemy, but if he was a friend, he would become a guarantee of safety. Now, the elves had finally walked out of the shadow of this curse. The whole camp was filled with a festive atmosphere because they had heard the news that Raphael would come to visit the elves today. Since the orcs had betrayed the covenant, the elves had been living under heavy pressure. They could not see their own future, only death and destruction. Raphael's public visit was of great significance. If they could become friends with this powerful lord, they would no longer have to be afraid of external threat. Many elves hated the orcs and did not believe in them. Therefore, although the Senate had made the final decision, Lydia still had a lot of room to move. However, no one doubted this powerful lord. There were many reasons, and the most important one was, of course, the existence of Sunir. Moreover, Lydia had intentionally or unintentionally revealed the secret that Raphael had secretly visited the elves and got along very well with Gaobin. For the elves, this news was normal. Gaobin was Sunir's brother. How could they not get along well? Almost every elf was smiling. They knew that the days of suffering were over. Only Gaobin couldn't smile. At this moment, he was anxiously searching the campsite. Of course, the anxiousness here was only referring to his mood. He wouldn't let anyone see through his expression. Lydia, Julia, and Constance were walking towards him. Seeing Gaobin hurriedly turn around, Lydia asked curiously, "Gaobin, what are you doing?" Gaobin looked around and saw that there were no other elves. He whispered, "Have you seen Sunir?" "Yes." Lydia also whispered, "She went to the south of the camp. She seems to be in a bad mood. They greeted her, but she just nodded to us. She didn't even say anything. She just walked past us." "How can she be in a good mood?" Julia sighed softly. "I'll go talk to her." Gaobin's expression darkened. "Lydia, Raphael will be here soon. You guys find Blanche and go greet her. I'll be back as soon as possible." Sunir was the only person missing from today's banquet. Otherwise, rumors would definitely spread among the elves. "All right." Lydia nodded. On the hillside in the south of the camp, Sunir was sitting there quietly. Her slender body was curled up into a ball, with her hands in front of her knees. Her back was stooped, and her pretty face was buried between her knees. The lonely figure of her back looked particularly sad. No matter how strong Sunir was, she still had her limits. Rocks were hard enough, but if an external force was too strong, the rocks would crumble and shatter. Nothing was absolute in this world. Everything was relative. Her heart was full of bitterness, but she couldn't find anyone to talk to. It was a joyous occasion to see her own brother, but who knew that not long after, her brother would reveal a cruel truth that almost tore her heart apart. For the past few days, Sunir couldn't fall asleep. During the day, she tried her best to act normal. At night, she would hide in her tent or find a quiet place outside to think about her troubles alone. She couldn't tell Gaobin. One reason was that although Gaobin was her brother, they hadn't seen each other for a few decades, so he felt like a stranger. She wasn't used to opening her heart to a stranger, even though they were related by blood. Another reason was that Gaobin had become the leader of the army and religion. He was busy from morning to night every day. Sunir was strong. Or rather, she kept telling herself to be strong. She couldn't let her personal matters affect the grand plan of the elves. Gaobin's eyes were very sharp. He noticed Sunir's figure from afar. He quickly walked towards Sunir, but Sunir had completely lost her alertness. She didn't even realize that someone was approaching. When he was less than 10 meters away from Sunir, Gaobin wanted to greet her. However, at this moment, Sunir's figure overlapped with another familiar figure. Gaobin felt his heart twitch violently. Waves of tearing pain almost made it difficult for him to breathe. When he left Wild Willow City, was Shia also like this? History was always so similar. Back then, Gaobin left in anger because of the violent interference of the Senate, leaving behind the lonely and despairing Hazel. What about now? Would his only family member also sink in pain? Was this Hazel's curse, or was it karma? Gaobin calmed his emotions and said, "Sunir?" Sunir's figure trembled. She paused for a moment before slowly turning around. She smiled and said, "Brother, why are you here?" Gaobin could see that although Sunir's smile was still as beautiful and impeccable, her eyes were filled with a kind of withering gray. His heart ached even more. He slowly said, "He's almost here." Sunir knew who Gaobin was referring to. She couldn't help but close her eyes and whisper, "Brother, today? I'm not feeling well." "Sunir, listen to me." Gaobin sighed. "You didn't do anything wrong, so there's no need to be afraid. If you have to be afraid, then it's him." Gaobin couldn't continue. Sunir wasn't wrong, but was Han Jin wrong? "This isn't a matter of whether I'm afraid or not." Sunir's gaze fell on Gaobin's face. She stared into Gaobin's eyes. "Brother, must I go see him? For the elven race?" "No." Sunir's words were a little harsh. Gaobin smiled bitterly. "At least you have to give yourself and him a chance." While Sunir and Gaobin were talking, the god of war had already landed beside the elven camp. Lydia, Blanche, Julia, Constance, and the other elves who were familiar with Han Jin came out of the camp to welcome him. There were also various tribe leaders and some elders from the United Senate. The god of war was already huge in the air. When it landed on the ground, it gave the elves an even stronger visual impact. Those elves who had never seen the god of war before secretly clicked their tongues in amazement. As for those elves who knew about the origins of the god of war, they flaunted their knowledge. Very quickly, the majority of the elves knew that such a huge god of war was actually a magic tool. Furthermore, it was personally made by Lord Raphael. Han Jin was the first to land. Lydia took a few steps forward and smiled. "You're here." Han Jin nodded and glanced behind Lydia. He smiled and said, "What a grand welcoming ceremony. We're all family. You don't have to be so formal." Previously, the elders and patriarchs had only heard that Han Jin and Gaobin got along well, and Han Jin's family had provided clear evidence of this. Even some patriarchs, who had been grieving for Updura and Prudence, rejoiced in their hearts. They knew that if Updura and Prudence were here, the relationship between the two sides would never be so friendly. "Julia, did you miss me?" A loud voice sounded. It was Moxink, who was the second one to jump down from the roof. "Get lost." Julia pretended to be angry. Some of the tribe leaders and elders looked at each other. They never thought that something bad would happen to Julia. How could she use vulgarities to insult a guest? Although the other party's words were not pleasant to the ears, and there was a hint of flirting, it would be over soon. What was the point of doing this? They did not understand the relationship between Julia and Han Jin and the others. Whether it was Julia who was flirted with or Morrison's who was scolded, no one took it seriously. "You're wrong. Julia will definitely miss you, but not us," Leger said with a smile. "Then who is she thinking of?" Sasu asked from the back. "Yeah, who is she thinking of?" Morrison's also asked loudly. However, Sasua's expression and tone were just right, as if he really did not understand. Morrison's words were so pretentious that they could float 50 kilometers away. Julia's face was slightly red. She no longer paid attention to these fellows. Her gaze drifted upwards as if she was looking for something. "Stop looking, he's not here, hee." Morrison's laugh. "He's not here?" Julia was stunned. Yeah, Leger and Sasu said at the same time. Julia's expression changed. She looked at Han Jin with dissatisfaction. The battleship was so big that it would not care about having one more person. If he really did not come, then it must be Han Jin's intention. What's wrong? Han Jin asked in surprise. You. Julia was anxious and angry. She did not believe that Han Jin really did not understand. However, the anxiety and disappointment in her heart made her lose her rationality. Julia simply said it out loud, "Where's Gibran?" "He has something to do, so he stayed in the Holy Crown City," Han Jin said softly. Julia's mood suddenly fell. She and Gibran were in the honeymoon period, and had always been inseparable. This time, for the sake of her people, she resolutely left Gibran and returned to the elves to participate in the battle. She had not seen Gibran for dozens of days, and she missed him so much. Knowing that Gibran did not come, her disappointment was imaginable. But, Han Jin thought for a while, "Julia, you know that I have a lot of magical spells. If you really want to see Gibran, I can release a spell and summon him from the Holy Crown City." Summon? Julia was stunned. Was Gibran a magical beast? How could he summon him? Julia wasn't the only one. The patriarchs and elders around her were also full of anticipation. Things in this world were always so strange. If they had known that Han Jin was going to release magic here a few days ago, they would definitely have fled in all directions. But now they were all waiting with an admiring attitude. "Do you really want to see Gibran?" Han Jin asked. Yes. Julia didn't know whether it was because she wanted to see Han Jin's magic or because she really wanted to see Gibran, but she answered quickly. Okay. Han Jin also responded quickly, and then took a deep breath. The elves around opened their eyes wide, for fear that they would miss a good show. Oem Manai Pami Hum. Han Jin sang a spell that others couldn't understand, especially the last word Oem, which was majestic and long, with the momentum to swallow mountains and rivers. Then he waved his hand, "Come!" The next moment, Gibran's figure appeared on the side of the ship. His face was full of helplessness, and then he turned over and jumped off the ship. What a powerful spell! Julia was so angry that she raised her eyebrows and said in a sarcastic tone, "Gibran, you were summoned from the Holy Crown City just like that?" At this point, Julia of course realized that she had been fooled, and they had all fooled her. The most unforgivable thing was that Gibran actually cooperated with them. What kind of *T magic is this? Gibran muttered in a low voice and observed Julia's face in fear. "Julia, don't blame me. They caught me and didn't let me out or talk." "Who caught you?" Julia said angrily. She didn't believe it at all, because among the young people, Gibran was the strongest except for Han Jin. Guevara was, of course, stronger than Gibran, but would Guevara cooperate with the guys in front of her to make such a low-level joke? A tall figure appeared on the side of the ship and looked down with a smile. It was Dominique. Julia immediately lost her temper. The strength of a Thunder Titan was unquestionable. She didn't hate Gibran now, but felt pity for him. It must be very uncomfortable to be caught by such a pair of giant hands, right? Gibran helplessly spread out his hands. His meaning was obvious. "Did you see it?" "I can't move at all." Lydia had been watching the youngsters fooling around with a smile on her face. The other elves still hadn't figured out whether it was a joke or the effect of magic. Han Jin's magic was famous for not being able to sense any waves. Some said that it was a joke, while others said that it was magic. They were all quietly debating about it. A figure flashed, and Guevara fell from the sky and landed steadily on the ground. Lydia's eyes flashed. "Welcome, Master Guevara." She and Guevara were old enemies. In isolated Cliff City, she had even attacked Guevara. However, she didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so she couldn't use magic arrows. In the end, nothing happened. "Thank you," Guevara replied lightly. At this time, Blanche stepped forward and said seriously, "Master Raphael, thank you." She was thankful for Han Jin's warning. Otherwise, with their defenses, they wouldn't have been able to stop the attack of the orcs. Perhaps most of the elves would have been killed by the orcs or become their playthings. Haha, you're too polite. Han Jin smiled. My mouth is dry after walking all the way here. Blanche was stunned. Han Jin and the others flew here on the God of War, and the ship naturally had a lot of supplies. How could he be dry? She thought quickly and suddenly remembered the first time she saw Han Jin. Han Jin had asked her for water. She couldn't help but cover her mouth with her hand and chuckle. Moon spring water? Don't worry, you have it. Dominique also jumped to the ground, followed by Stillberg and Miriam. Of course, they couldn't jump off the ship. They would fall to their deaths, so they could only obediently climb down the suspension ladder. Lydia waited for a while. Seeing that there were no more movements from the ship, she knew that there were only so many guests. She bowed and said with a smile, "Please follow me." Then she led the way into the camp. Han Jin's eyes followed Lydia's body. His face suddenly became hesitant. He whispered, "Morrisons, it's all up to you." Han Jin had planned for 2 whole days for this meeting. He didn't care about what to talk about with the elves. What he was worried about was how to deal with Sunir. For this, he thought of many ways and made all kinds of preparations. "You don't trust my acting?" Morrison's University said casually. "Isn't it just acting dumb?" "No problem at all." "Yes," Leger continued, "Morrison's doesn't need to act at all. Just be yourself." Morrison's was stunned, then immediately became angry. He gritted his teeth and said, "Leger, you want to fight again, don't you?" "That's not right, Morrison's. That's not right," Leger said seriously. "You don't understand what I'm saying at all. Laughing like an idiot is acting dumb, do you understand?" Under normal circumstances, Morrison's wasn't a match for Leger and Sassu when it came to arguing. This time was no exception, and now wasn't the time to escalate the conflict. He could only glare fiercely at Leger. Han Jin's gaze swept across the room and landed on Stillberg and Miriam. He said softly, "Stillberg, Miriam, it's all up to you." At this moment, Han Jin was like an ordinary young man who was troubled by his feelings. "Young master, don't worry." Stillberg nodded heavily. His expression was slightly dispirited. "Young master, don't worry," Miriam said, her expression even more dispirited. After receiving the mission, Stillberg and Miriam had a long heart-to-heart talk. This kind of talk was very tempering. The content was nothing more than swearing, doubting, swearing again, and doubting again. Miriam didn't know how many times she imagined and talked about the future. If Stillberg did something, she would definitely do something. As the saying went, like master, like servant. This saying was pure nonsense. At least Stillberg had his own principles. Miriam was born poor. To her, the sudden arrival on the God of War was like a paradise to her. However, she didn't lose herself. On the contrary, she worked hard to prove the value of her existence so that others wouldn't look down on her. Han Jin and Stillberg, master and servant, were taken care of by her meticulously. Stillberg, who had tasted hardship, suddenly found such a considerate wife. He would wake up from his dreams with a smile. Whenever he saw something delicious or fun, the first thing he thought of was either Han Jin or Miriam. He couldn't possibly have any other thoughts. This pair of lovebirds was completely tormenting themselves. One was constantly worried and fearful, afraid that her happiness would suddenly disappear. The other wanted to dig out her heart and show it to the other, but she couldn't really do it. Thus, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make herself understand. "Raphael, who are you relying on?" Morrison said unhappily. "Ha." Han Jin smiled bitterly. "Let's go." Chapter 406. Because this war broke out too suddenly, the elves who were attacked were almost unprepared, and they lost an astronomical amount of resources. In order to cover up his shabbiness, Gaubin simply moved the location of the banquet to a small lake in the east of the camp. The green grass was luxuriant, and the warm wind was pleasant. Accompanied by the moonlight, the lake water, and the tree stumps and wooden tables, it was a unique scenery. Han Jin and the others took their seat. The tribe leaders and some elven elders also sat down. Not long after, Blanche walked over to Han Jin with an exquisite crystal teapot. She poured a cup for Han Jin and said softly, "If it's not enough, I have more." Han Jin had saved so many elves, so of course she wouldn't be stingy. "Thank you." Han Jin smiled. He then picked up the teacup and drank it all in one gulp. A refreshing feeling spread in his chest. The lunar water was indeed good stuff. He didn't want to drink the rest and was going to take it away. Blanche walked to the side and took another teapot from an elf. She poured water for Guevara, Morrison's, and the others. However, when she walked to Dominique, she was stunned. She didn't think it through. She didn't expect such a giant to appear. The cup in her hand was pitifully small compared to Dominique's body. With this ratio, let alone drinking water, even alcohol couldn't be drunk like this. "I'm not thirsty." "Don't bother," Dominique said softly. "We didn't think it through enough." Blanche raised her head and wanted to find an elf to exchange for a bigger cup. Then, she saw Gaubin and Sunir slowly walking over one after another. The scene suddenly became quiet. Many elves opened their eyes wide, ready to watch the scene of Han Jin and Sunir meeting. They didn't know that Han Jin had already gone to Wild Willow City. The elders sighed in their hearts. "If you knew this day would come, why did you do it in the first place?" Gaubin strode in front of Han Jin and smiled. "You're here." He only greeted him and didn't even need to call him by his title. Han Jin nodded, then turned to look at Sunir. However, Sunir did not look back at him. Her head was lowered, and her watery eyes were fixed on the grass. "Sunir, come and sit here," Han Jin said with a smile. Sunir's reaction was out of everyone's expectations. It was as if she did not hear Han Jin's words as she kept her head down. She turned around and sat down beside Constance. All the tribe leaders and elders were shocked as they stared at Sunir. Gaubin was also surprised. He opened his mouth to say something, but closed it again. He glanced at Han Jin from the corner of his eyes, and a trace of worry appeared in his eyes. Han Jin was no longer the young man he used to be. As the lord of the Holy Crown City, his attitude influenced the likes and dislikes of a group of powerhouses and decided the direction of an entire group. Disrespecting Han Jin was equivalent to disrespecting an entire group, and to the current elven race, it could even lead to a disastrous outcome. Han Jin smiled. His smile was casual, as if he had already expected this situation. He then stood up and took 2 steps before turning back to grab the crystal teapot and cup, and strode towards Sunir. He then gave Constance a look, indicating for her to make way for him. Constance had suffered under Han Jin before, and she did not want to affect Han Jin and Sunir. She quickly stood up and moved aside. "This is the moon spring water of the elves. It tastes good, why don't you have some?" Han Jin smiled. Sunir of course knew who sat beside her. She could not describe the feeling in her heart. There was bitterness, pain, and a thick sourness. She looked up and turned her eyes away, refusing to look at Han Jin. As she turned her head, she saw a burly man approaching her. Sunir was surprised. "Morrisons, why are you here?" "I miss you, of course I'm here," Morrisons said with a smile. Sassu and Leger also came over, and chatted with Sunir. Han Jin's entire plan revolved around one word: love. Sunir was a sentimental elf. She could ignore Han Jin for various reasons, but she would never embarrass her old friends like Morrisons and Sassu in front of so many people. As for Han Jin, he had already mustered up his courage and was prepared to face any difficulties. As expected, Sunir was reluctant to answer Morrisons and the other two, but her attitude was very passive. She did not say anything, and most of the time, she only nodded or smiled. That was her answer. They were reminiscing in front of everyone, but there were not many topics to talk about, and Sunir was very passive. After a short while, Sassu and Leger ran out of things to say. Only Morrison's continued to talk. Even if Sunir did not respond, he would still laugh and continue talking. Morrison's topics were very broad, but they were all related to one central idea. No matter how far he went, he would always come back to the topic. The so-called central idea was, Sunir, everyone missed you so much, everyone present could see that there was something strange going on. Even Sunir herself knew it. However, Morrison's was only talking to her. She had no reason to scold Morrison's, and she did not want to do so. In the end, she could only slowly lower her head and no longer respond. Suddenly, she could not hear Morrison's voice anymore. She raised her head and saw Stilberg and Miriam standing in front of her. Sunir's gaze fell on the pair of hands that were tightly clasped together. She said in surprise, "You guys." In order to avoid awkwardness, Gaubin had already loudly called for the elves to serve up wine. In fact, he was also a little embarrassed. He had wanted to discuss the next step of the cooperation with Han Jin in front of everyone, but Han Jin was not interested in it. He had run downstairs, leaving an empty seat. Fortunately, Han Jin was there to fill the empty seat. Otherwise, he would not know who to talk to. Sunir's attitude towards Stilberg was very good, especially after she found out that Stilberg and Miriam were married. She even pulled Miriam to her side and whispered something to her. It could be said that Sunir treated all her old friends well, except for Han Jin. She had always ignored Han Jin and refused to acknowledge his existence. However, Sunir did not mind Sunir's attitude and maintained a calm appearance. Gradually, the crowd was divided into a few small circles. Gao Bin, Lydia, and the other elves were happily chatting with Gavara. Hatred could not be erased, but it could be temporarily forgotten. In this regard, Gavara was very open-minded. Although he was the loser in the end and tasted the loss of his home and country, that was war. If he and Zagund had succeeded in occupying the Holy Crown City, then the next step would have been to attack Wild Willow City. On the other hand, if he had not sent out his troops, then Dismark and Wild Willow City would not have let him go after defeating Zagund. Some tribal chiefs were respectfully talking to Dominguez. Dominguez's shining silver eyes had already proved her identity. Thunder Titan. It was widely acknowledged that the Thunder Titan's combat power was definitely higher than that of a superior gold dragon. Even if they encountered a golden behemoth, they would still have the strength to fight. Moreover, the Thunder Titan's combat style was very comprehensive. Apart from the fact that they could not fly, they could display great combat power in both long-range and close combat. It could even be said that in the face of a group of Thunder Titans, ordinary combat tactics were completely meaningless. Morrison's, Sassu, and the others gathered around Sunir again. In another world, there was a saying, remembering the bitterness and thinking of the sweetness, and what they were repeating was nothing more than how happy they were when they were together, and how boring it was without her. Han Jin tried to talk to Sunir several times, but he was always rebuffed. In the end, he fell into silence. Almost everyone in the hall was laughing, and only Han Jin seemed to be very lonely. Blanche wanted to come over and chat with Han Jin for a while. At least, she could not ignore Han Jin too much. However, she knew the purpose of those young people pestering Sunir, so she did not want to disturb them. She could only watch silently from afar. At some point, Hogan brought Little Gold Bolt to the hall. Sunir was, of course, very happy, and Little Gold Bolt was also chirping non-stop. Unfortunately, magic beasts had limited intelligence and it could not understand. There was something in the world called forcing a smile. Late at night, the banquet ended without any real progress. Morrison's and the others, who had things on their minds, were all exhausted. Sunir was also tired. She wanted to be alone and not participate in some banquet. After Sunir left the hall, Many enthusiastic elves kept passing messages to Morrison's and the others. Sunir went into the tent, and then she came out again, and then she went south. When the elves passed on the message, they would more or less glance at Han Jin. Their purpose was obvious. They were not telling Morrison's, but Han Jin. Raphael, I tried my best. Morrison's coughed a few times. Listen, my voice is hoarse. Raphael, actually, all of us together are not as good as you. You should talk to Sunir yourself, Sasu said seriously. But Sunir has been ignoring him, Morrison said. If she doesn't even talk to us, then it's really bad. Since she can talk to us, it means. Leger scratched his head. She still cares about the past. Nonsense. Morrison's finally found an opportunity to attack Leger. Raphael, you have to be mentally prepared. Sasua's face was full of sympathy. Even if you can coax Sunir, you still have to coax Yelena later. Sigh, so troublesome. You should be like me, alone and free. Disgusting. Leger rolled his eyes. What do you mean? Sasu was stunned. Alone and free? Then why are you still bothering Lorraine? Your words, why do they sound so sour? Sasu said, I'm discussing magic with Lorraine. Are you jealous of me? Morrison's eyes shone with excitement. He looked at Leger and then at Sasu. These two had always been in an alliance to deal with him. Now, he finally saw hope. Put this away from me. Han Jin suddenly pointed at the crystal teapot on the wooden table. He had only drunk 2 cups of the moonlight spring water before he couldn't drink anymore. Then, his body shrank into the ground and disappeared without a trace. Where did Raphael go? Morrison's asked. Do you still need to ask? He must have gone to find Sunir, Sasu replied. The elves could see that Han Jin had been treated coldly, so no one came to greet Han Jin. Gaobin saw that Han Jin had suddenly disappeared. He hesitated for a moment, then called Lydia over and whispered a few words. Then, he stood up and said goodbye to Morrison's and the others, then walked back to the camp. Sunir returned to the hillside. Her mind was in a mess. A serious problem was placed in front of her. The elves had suffered heavy losses. If she wanted to regain peace, she must maintain a good relationship with Han Jin. This also meant that she couldn't fall out with Han Jin. Things were so ridiculous. Back then, Amtel forced her to marry Prudence for the future of the elves. Now, he was forcing her to reconcile with Han Jin for the future of the elves. Of course, Gaobin wouldn't force her. He only wanted her to think and decide for herself. But the reality was in front of her. Sunir was very clear about the current situation. However, could it be that her entire life was to be sacrificed for something? Sunir, with her strong personality, hated the feeling of being controlled and manipulated. A figure rose from a place not far away and stood quietly behind Sunir, silently looking at Sunir. Sunir's back trembled. She slowly said, Did you come to me to hear me apologize for what the elves have done to you? Or, do you want to apologize to me? She had deliberately ignored Han Jin at the banquet because what she wanted to express could only be said by the two of them face to face. She couldn't say it out loud in front of others. She was definitely not throwing a tantrum. So when Han Jin appeared behind her, she took the initiative to speak. Han Jin wanted to say something, but he stopped. He didn't know how to answer. Do you think it's meaningful? Sunir continued softly. I was wrong. It's my fault. Han Jin paused. But I had no choice. That day, Yelena was already fatally injured, but she still tried to crawl towards me, trying to help me break free from the curse. Sunir, you can't understand how I felt at that time. I will never forget that scene. In fact, Yelena is now dead. If it wasn't for the fact that she signed a contract with the Phoenix, she would have died long ago. I can't let her down no matter what. So, you can let me down. Sunir smiled, but her smile was bleak. Raphael, I suddenly realized that our relationship isn't as deep as we thought. Because you don't understand me at all. What? Han Jin was stunned. Yelena isn't the main point. Although I feel for her. Haha, I can do it without caring. Sunir smiled again. The most painful thing for me is that after more than 2 years of life and death together, why can't I gain your trust? They said that I married Prudence, so would I really marry him? Raphael, if I tell you now that I've decided to give up our past, you have no right to blame me, because you gave it up first. Han Jin was silent. After a while, he said in a low voice, at that time, I was still very immature. And then? That's it? Actually, I can see that you can't give up our past. Han Jin said softly, those days, those experiences, those feelings, they have already been integrated into our blood and can no longer be separated. So, although you didn't want to stay at the banquet and didn't want to talk to others, you forced yourself to not let your friends feel awkward. Haha, you also cherished Morrison so much. Can you really forget me? You. Sunir's lips suddenly trembled, and tears finally overflowed from her eyes. Raphael, you are so cruel. How could you say such things to me? You are so cruel. I'm not cruel. I'm afraid that you won't give me a chance to change. Han Jin sighed, took 2 steps forward, and slowly reached out his hand to wipe the tears on Sunir's cheeks. Sunir turned her head away and turned her sight away from him. I can't forget you either. Han Jin said in a low voice, who shared the secret with me. Who risked their lives to hunt the bear of earth for me. Who was seriously injured and nailed to a tree, but still didn't forget me. Haha. If it weren't for you reminding Morrisons, I wouldn't have survived until now. You've already given up. Sunir's tone was indifferent. Besides, you don't have to thank me. If it weren't for you fighting to the death for everyone, none of us would have survived. I should be the one thanking you. Not bad, not bad. But for some reason, when I hear your words, I feel as if a dagger is stabbing into my chest. Han Jin walked to Sunir's side and slowly crouched down. He stared into Sunir's eyes. What about you? Are you in as much pain as I am? Me? I'm fine. Sunir tried her best to smile, but more tears flowed down her cheeks. Is that so? It seems that you're much stronger than I am. Han Jin also smiled. Then continue. Think about it again. What else can hurt me more? Just say it. Sunir stared at Han Jin in a daze, her lips trembling. She wanted to continue, but she didn't know what else to say. But it's fine if you only target me. Han Jin reached out his hand to wipe the tears off Sunir's face. This time, Sunir didn't avoid it. The method you should choose is to only hurt me. Sunir, you should learn to protect yourself. The feeling of being touched came too late. Sunir couldn't help but slowly close her eyes. You can't find it, right? Do you know why? Han Jin slowly said. Because our hearts are connected. If I'm in pain, you'll be in pain. If you're happy, I'll be happy. Connected? Are we really connected? Sunir bitterly smiled. Then why are you doubting my feelings? You're doubting my courage? I was wrong. Han Jin once again admitted his mistake. This is also because I was too worried about you. The elves suddenly attacked our bite man, which already made me a little suspicious. Later, I heard from the elven prisoners that you were already married to Prudence. Later, they actually found a fake you to lure me into a trap. Sunir's hands twisted together. What Han Jin said was the truth. The instigator was Anpugula, the elves themselves. If the elves didn't suddenly launch an invasion, she and Han Jin wouldn't have misunderstood each other. Chapter 407. In her own tent, Sunir slowly drifted into dreamland. She did not want to sleep, but the sleepless nights for the past few days had exhausted her to the extreme. Besides, Han Jin was here. No matter what kind of attitude she displayed towards Han Jin, there was one thing she could never deny. Han Jin was the first man to open her heart. There was an indescribable feeling. Perhaps seeing this man would make her pain and bitterness sharper, but her heart would not be so empty. Han Jin stood quietly in front of the bed made of tree branches, staring at Sunir. He had been standing there for a very long time. As the saying goes, what one thinks in the day, one dreams at night. It could be seen that Sunir's dreams were not peaceful, because her eyebrows would furrow from time to time. A person's heart would always be soft. The so-called toughness was just to protect oneself, to use a layer of hard shell to cover the easily injured areas. It was like a warrior wearing armor. No matter if it was a man or a woman, they all had a weak side. Han Jin finally moved. He slowly walked towards Sunir, reached out his fingertips, and gently stroked Sunir's hair. Then, he bent down and kissed Sunir's furrowed brows. Afterward, he quietly backed away, slowly lifted the curtain, and walked out of the tent. At the same time that Han Jin left, Sunir slowly opened her eyes. In the torment of the illusion in the divine temple, her alertness had become exceptionally sharp. Han Jin did not understand what Sunir had experienced. In fact, the moment his fingertips touched the ends of her hair, Sunir had been startled awake. However, she did not move. She looked at the fluttering curtain, and once again, uncontrollable tears flowed from her eyes. Sunir forcefully turned over, hiding her head in the pillow that emitted the fragrance of grass. She also hid her crying face. Han Jin walked out of the tent and immediately saw Gao Bin. He smiled. "You've been following us all this time, haven't you?" "Yes." Gao Bin nodded. "I'm not worried about you, but..." The two of them were speechless. Han Jin thought of Hai Ro and Gao Bin's reaction at that time. Little did he know that Gao Bin was also thinking of Hai Ro. "Oh right, did Yelena also come with you?" Gao Bin suddenly asked. "Yes," Han Jin said. Yelena had already treated the god of war as another home. Just because they were visiting the elves, it was somewhat inappropriate for her to disembark. "Why don't I see her? Is it appropriate?" Han Jin asked. Hee. Gao Bin sighed and said, "I have been admiring your Wargod for a long time. Can you let me go up and take a look? Of course, if it's too late, it's too late." This. Han Jin was a little hesitant, and his tone became a little forced. Okay. No matter what, Gao Bin was still his brother-in-law. Everything that he was doing now, excluding the benefits, was to save his relationship with Sunir. Gao Bin's influence in this matter was very large. The two of them walked out of the campsite side by side, and came to the bottom of the God of War. The ship was brightly lit. Although they had already formed an alliance with the elves, they still had to be on guard against them. After all, everyone had already learned their lesson. There were about a dozen mountain warriors and a dozen magicians standing at the side of the ship, vigilantly observing the surroundings for any movements. Han Jin released the earth-shrinking spell, and his figure disappeared. Then, he reappeared in midair and stepped lightly onto the God of War. Gao Bin observed Han Jin's movements with interest. Then, he jumped up. When he was about to reach the ship, he tapped his foot on the suspension ladder and jumped up again. He floated onto the deck of the ship. Guevara, Dominique, Morrisons, and the others had all returned. They were not used to resting in the elven camp. Like Yelena, they also treated this place as their home. Of course, this included Sunir. When they saw Gao Bin, everyone was shocked. Then, they all turned their eyes to an old man. It was Majordomo Gale. Gao Bin was Sunir's brother. If Sunir was in danger or in trouble, Gao Bin would definitely help her at all costs. Majordomo Gale was undoubtedly Yelena's protector. Gao Bin saw an unfamiliar old man sitting beside Guevara. Looking at his status, he should be at the same level as Guevara. He thought for a moment and smiled. "Majordomo Gale, right? Nice to meet you." Majordomo Gale immediately reacted. Morrisons and the others had talked about Gao Bin before. They said that Gao Bin was the elf who looked the least like an elf. If his thick beard grew on a human's face, it would not attract attention at all. However, when it grew on an elf's face, it was somewhat strange. "Nice to meet you, Gao Bin." Gao Bin smiled and nodded. He glanced around and said softly, "It seems that we are still missing a friend." It was impossible for Gao Bin to not have any hostility towards Yelena. There was a difference between friends and strangers, and no one could completely give up their selfishness. Therefore, he wanted to see with his own eyes what kind of woman could make Han Jin cherish her so much. Even the slowest Morrisons knew who Gao Bin was talking about. Everyone turned their eyes to Han Jin. Han Jin said softly, "I will go down and look for her." "Come, Gao Bin, sit here," Morrison's University said, and patted the chair beside him. Other than Han Jin, Morrison's, Sassu, and Stillberg were the ones who had the deepest relationship with Sunir. Morrison's and Sassu treated Sunir as a friend who had gone through thick and thin together, while Stillberg treated Sunir as his future mistress. Therefore, even though Sunir was in a bad mood, she still reluctantly chatted with these people for a while. "Sure." Gao Bin smiled. Perhaps it was because he had stayed in the human world for a long time, but Gao Bin's personality was very straightforward, which was very much in line with Morrison's temperament. Even if it wasn't for Sunir, he would still want to make friends with Gao Bin. In fact, Sassu and Leger also thought that Gao Bin was a good person, but they had a layer of concern. Gao Bin had been an all-powerful person for decades, and he had already activated the Mark of God. He was very powerful, and now he was the leader of the elves. If it wasn't for Han Jin, would such a big person like him think highly of them? Sassu and Leger had their own reservations and didn't want to deliberately make friends with anyone. Morrison's, on the other hand, didn't care so much as long as it was to his liking. At this moment, Han Jin had already arrived at his magic laboratory. Yelena was meditating in the room, which had already turned into a world of lightning. Countless electric arcs were emitting a faint glow, and occasionally, a narrow, twisted bolt of lightning would appear and disappear in a flash. Due to the influence of the electric arcs, Yelena looked as if she was wrapped in a storm. Her long hair was fluttering in the wind, and her magic robe was also fluttering without any wind. However, she was already meditating, and her expression was very serene, which was a sharp contrast to her ostentatious appearance. But this wasn't important. What was important was that Yelena was sitting in a cross-legged position, which was absolutely authentic. Of course, this was what Han Jin had taught her. Magic meditation was very similar to cultivation meditation. When all mages entered meditation, they would either sit or stand. They wouldn't sit cross-legged, but would sit in a comfortable armchair so that their bodies could relax and their minds could focus. Mages generally entered meditation in 3 states. One was when they were very energetic, one was when they were a little tired, and the last was when their magic power was exhausted. The first was the main method of cultivation, the second was to enter a state of meditation sleep, and the last was to replenish their magic power. Unlike magic, most cultivators entered meditation by sitting cross-legged. This didn't sound like much, but in fact, sitting cross-legged was very important. Because one had to maintain the balance of one's body, it was very difficult to enter the true state of concentration. Sitting on a chair or lying down to cultivate was even more undesirable. In the cultivation world, sleep was often called the sleeping devil, to the extent that it could be described as a devil. It could be seen that sleep was harmful to the state of concentration, especially for beginners, who had to avoid it by all means. When Han Jin had first started cultivating, his master had repeatedly told him not to sleep while meditating. Of course, doing so would give him high-quality sleep and make him feel more energetic the next day, but once it became a habit, it would be difficult for him to make any progress for the rest of his life. Meditation required the body to relax, but it couldn't be completely relaxed. Sitting cross-legged met these 2 requirements. Because of their different civilization, although Yelena had seen Han Jin cultivate, she didn't realize the benefits of sitting in that way. On the contrary, she thought it was too weird. But at Han Jin's request, she reluctantly changed her habit. Faint electric arcs flickered at the tip of Yelena's nose. As she breathed, she inhaled and exhaled. At this moment, her body should be full of electric arcs as well. Perhaps because she sensed Han Jin's gaze, Yelena opened her eyes little by little. When she saw Han Jin, she let out a long breath and said softly, "Why are you here? How long have you been meditating?" Han Jin smiled. "Probably." Yelena thought for a moment. "A few hours. Didn't I tell you to rest for a while after half an hour? I don't have anything else to do anyway. Don't blame me. You brought this upon yourself." "What?" Yelena didn't understand. She looked up at Han Jin and saw Han Jin smirk. She hurriedly asked, "What do you mean?" "Nothing." Han Jin walked slowly to Yelena's side. "How do you feel?" "This posture is too tiring," Yelena said coquettishly. "It seems like only 10 minutes have passed, and my legs are sore, numb, and painful." And then I persevered. Yelena raised her head, her face full of pride, as if she was telling Han Jin, "How is it? I'm strong, right?" Yes, very good, very good." Han Jin's smile deepened. "Get up." "Okay." Yelena responded. She straightened her body, but suddenly froze in place, and her expression changed drastically. Yelena wanted to move her legs, but they didn't listen to her at all. In a panic, she touched them with her hands and suddenly felt a very strange tactile sensation. Her fingers could touch her legs, and her fingertips could touch them, but her legs couldn't feel anything, as if she was touching someone else's legs. "Raphael!" Yelena suddenly panicked. My legs. What's going on? Have I become disabled? But I didn't do anything." Han Jin squatted down and looked at Yelena with a smile. "Who told you not to be obedient? Are you scared now?" Seeing Han Jin's smile, Yelena was relieved. She knew that if something really happened to her, Han Jin wouldn't be smiling. "It's okay," Han Jin said. "Have your legs ever been numb before? It's the same principle, but this time it's been numb for too long." As Han Jin spoke, he grabbed Yelena's ankle and broke off one leg. When he went to break the other leg, Yelena suddenly screamed. No, Yelena's scream was so ear-piercing that even Han Jin was startled. He looked at Yelena again and saw that her soft little face was twisted into a ball. She was grimacing in pain, and tears were about to flow out. The elegance and serenity she had just now had completely disappeared. Just now, she had moved her body, and Han Jin had forcibly broken off her leg, so the blocked qi and blood had begun to circulate. Yelena felt as if thousands of steel needles were constantly pricking her from her toes to her thighs. It was unbearable. Han Jin cast a few talismans, and a white light disappeared into Yelena's legs. Then, ignoring Yelena's resistance, he grabbed Yelena's toes and began to move them bit by bit. Yelena gritted her teeth and grabbed Han Jin's robe, crying out in pain. After rubbing one leg, he continued to rub the other leg. After a few minutes, Yelena finally recovered a little. However, her tears were also coming out. If it was just the pain, it would be fine, but there was also an unbearable feeling of numbness which was even more unbearable than the pain. "Is it enough?" Han Jin stood up and stretched out his hand to Yelena. "Come, try to stand up." He didn't mean to make Yelena suffer. She couldn't circulate her qi and blood, so she could only recover slowly. Yelena bit her lips and put her small hand in Han Jin's palm to stand up. Then, with a scream, her body went limp and she fell into Han Jin's arms. Her feet stood on the floor, and the numbness that should have disappeared became intense again. "Who asked you to be disobedient? Do you still dare to do it in the future?" Han Jin simply bent down and carried Yelena in his arms. "You didn't tell me it would be like this." Yelena felt wronged. "Actually, this is nothing. Just grit your teeth and it'll be over." Han Jin comforted her. "Do you know how long I endured the first time I sat like this?" "How long?" A whole day and night. The look in Han Jin's eyes became complicated. At that time, my teacher simply tied my hands and feet with magic. At first, it was a little uncomfortable, but I endured it and it was fine. The real pain came after more than 10 hours. That feeling was simply driving me crazy. Although I couldn't move, it was as if I had run for dozens of miles. I was sweating profusely. When teacher removed the magic and let me regain my freedom, I was like you, no. I was even worse than you. I cried for a long time. Yelena opened her mouth wide and stared blankly at Han Jin. After that, I rested for a day and then teacher tied my hands and feet again with magic. This time, he forced me to suffer for 3 whole days. He didn't give me food or water. He just made me sit there. Han Jin sighed. Oh my God! Yelena exclaimed. Your teacher is simply inhuman. What did you say? Han Jin pretended to be angry. He knew that Yelena didn't mean it, so of course, he wouldn't be angry. How could he torture you like this? Yelena was really angry. If Han Jin's teacher was here, perhaps Yelena would have scolded him regardless of everything. Teacher said that my aptitude is not bad, but he doesn't understand my perseverance and perseverance. Therefore, he forced me to pass the first obstacle as quickly as possible because he didn't have much time left. Han Jin smiled. And teacher also said that if you can endure hardships that others can't endure, you can do things that others can't do. After becoming his teacher's disciple, Han Jin would occasionally meet other cultivators who understood his teacher's heritage and would always show jealousy. They didn't know how much Han Jin had endured because of this. Of course, it was his luck to be able to gain his teacher's favor, but luck alone was absolutely not enough. His teacher had always been very satisfied with him. Was it because of his luck and aptitude? No, it was because he was satisfied with his efforts and dedication. Especially when he first started learning, he spent all his time and energy on cultivation. He didn't even forget to read a book while eating. Other cultivators were only interested in his circumstances and deliberately ignored his sweat. Perhaps this was the essential difference between the weak and the strong. I understand, Yelena murmured. What do you understand? Han Jin asked in surprise. I always thought that your strength grew so fast because your aptitude was better than mine, Yelena said very seriously. Now I understand everything. It's just that my luck is better than yours. I didn't suffer much here. Han Jin smiled. His state of mind had reached a certain level, and to start all over again, he just needed energy. Yelena didn't know what here meant, so she only nodded as if she understood. Now try, you should be able to walk, Han Jin said as he gently put Yelena down. As soon as Yelena's toes touched the floor, she immediately frowned. However, Han Jin's unintentional sentiments just now had a strong motivational effect on her. She gritted her teeth and tried to walk little by little. Of course, her hand was still tightly holding on to Han Jin. Han Jin helped Yelena walk around the room a few times, and her movements became faster and faster. He smiled and said, Let's go to the deck. There's an elf waiting for you. An elf? Yelena couldn't help but be stunned. She suddenly thought of Sunir. It's Gao Bin, Han Jin said softly. It's okay. You can talk about whatever he's talking about. Raphael, I'll go see him, okay? Yelena asked with difficulty. You'll have to see him sooner or later. Han Jin's voice was also strained. Last time, Yelena had said that she hoped that he would be happy. He vaguely understood what she meant, but he still couldn't guarantee it. So today, he could use Gao Bin to test her. If Yelena agreed to see him, he would be relieved. If she insisted on refusing, it meant that she didn't want to accept only half of Han Jin. You want me to see him? Yelena seemed to be straining even more. This was her test. Yelena wasn't ignorant. If Han Jin wanted her to see Gao Bin, then she understood Han Jin's intentions. Chapter 408. Let's go out. Han Jin paused. This is a matter of etiquette. Han Jin forced himself to shift the topic to etiquette, which was somewhat hypocritical. Yelena immediately understood Han Jin's intention. Her eyelids drooped slightly, and after a moment, a smile bloomed at the corner of her mouth. Yelena then said softly, "Okay." She had been preparing for this day for a long time. No matter how she felt, she remembered what she had said to make Han Jin happy. Moreover, the customs of the elves and humans were different. Her mother, Tiffany, had always been her role model. Therefore, although she felt a little disappointed and lost, she could accept this result. The moment Han Jin and Yelena stepped onto the deck, the surroundings gradually became quiet. Gao Bin, whose back was facing the ladder, sensed the change and slowly turned his head, his eyes falling on Yelena. "Gao Bin, let me introduce you. This is Yelena," Han Jin said softly. "Hello." Gao Bin smiled. "Hello." Yelena's eyes were a little panicked. She deliberately avoided Gao Bin's gaze, but after a moment, she bravely raised her head and looked directly at Gao Bin. Gao Bin was not convinced. He didn't believe that there was any woman who could be compared to Sunir. He thought that it was because she was willing to sacrifice herself for Han Jin that made Han Jin feel guilty and finally accepted her. However, the moment he saw Yelena's face, he couldn't help but be stunned. The scrutinizing look in his eyes turned into amazement. Her white, smooth, pure and flawless skin gave people a feeling that it could be broken by the slightest touch. Her pair of big, curved eyes were clear and bright. Her extremely long eyelashes looked lovely and delicate. Her thin lips were pursed into a line, like an unsheathed sword, with a valiant aura. She was a little shorter than Sunir, but her figure was exquisite and delicate. Hidden in her tender beauty was a little bit delicate, which made people feel tender to her. She was very attractive. Even from the perspective of the picky elves, Yelena was a stunning beauty. "Brother, I really admire you." Gao Bin sighed. Gao Bin was a man of character. Because of the series of mistakes made by Ampugula and Prudence, all the tragic consequences were caused. What was the truth? Denial and resistance could not change anything. Why should he be as annoying as a fly? He might as well admit it openly. Moreover, if he couldn't do it himself, he didn't have the right to ask others to do it. He couldn't forget the pain and struggle in his heart at that time. Moreover, Yelena's strength, family background, appearance, and her contribution to Han Jin all proved that she was a woman worth cherishing. As soon as Gao Bin's words left his mouth, the atmosphere suddenly became lively. Everyone on the ship secretly breathed a sigh of relief. They were also worried that Gao Bin would deliberately make things difficult for Yelena or even attack her verbally. However, what they feared did not happen. "Gao Bin, come and sit. What's there to talk about with those kids?" Guevara laughed and said, Come, I've admired you for a long time. When I was young, I even learned from your battles. Speaking of which, I really envy you elves. You're still so young, but I'm already old." Morrisons and the others looked at each other. Kid? This title made them very uncomfortable, but they could only listen. On the God of War, only Guevara had the right to take advantage of his seniority. Even Majordomo Gale could not. "Old? I don't think you're old at all." Gao Bin laughed. Of course, he knew that Guevara was returning the favor. He reached out and patted Morrison's shoulder affectionately, then stood up and walked towards Guevara. Yelena looked at Han Jin in surprise. "That's it? Just a greeting?" Han Jin smiled as he held Yelena's hand and sat beside her. In fact, he was also relieved. If Gao Bin was an elf who pestered him endlessly, he would have a huge headache. Because of Sunir, he could not retaliate and could only endure silently. However, if he endured for too long, there would be a huge change in the future due to his state of mind. He did not want that to happen. During the conversation at the banquet, both sides held back and only talked about some trivial matters. At this moment, Galbin had already won everyone's favor. This time, the conversation was much more in-depth. The atmosphere at Guevara and Galbin's table was the most lively. They talked about the war, various forces, and even Dragon City and Dragon Realm. Guevara and Galbin seemed to be very agreeable. In the end, Guevara could not help but sigh. Galbin, if you hadn't left Wild Willow City, I would never have cooperated with Zigund. Zigund? I've heard of him. Galbin's expression was slightly gloomy. Hazel later worked for Zigund, so when Zigund was mentioned, he would naturally think of Hazel. Dismark is good at defending, but not aggressive enough. Wild Willow City is the same. Although Zigund's style is cruel and extreme, he knows how to be aggressive. He is the only person I can choose to cooperate with. Guevara sighed again. Sigh, this is fate. Don't be dissatisfied. Leger finally found a chance to take revenge. He also did not want to be treated like a child. Now, where is Zigund? Where is Dismark? What about you? Guevara was stunned and glared at Leger. However, he did not refute. In fact, although he was the first person to be eliminated, he could still freely point out the situation here. Zigund and Dismark had already turned into ashes. This may not be a bad thing, Majordomo Gale said with a smile, then lowered his voice. If you and Galbin cooperate and defeat Dismark and Zigund, we may not be able to witness the rise of a genius. Genius! Guevara's gaze swept across Han Jin and he was speechless. Majordomo Gale was right. If he could cooperate with Galbin, the surrounding area would have already become their territory. Perhaps there would be a corresponding peace. Then, Han Jin would not have a stage that he could not lack. So, accept it. What fate gives us may not be a bad thing. Don't talk to me about this kind of mushy logic. I know it better than you, Guevara said unhappily. Yes, I know you do. Majordomo Gale suddenly thought of something and sighed. But not everyone does. What are you trying to say? Guevara frowned. The Holy See was attacked, and Jed's reaction was a little out of control. Majordomo Gale said in a low voice. He looked a little worried. The important Great Gravity Magic Scroll was obtained by Han Jin from Grand Duke Solomon through him. So, he vaguely understood that all of this was Han Jin's doing. However, he believed in Solomon's judgment. He also believed that Han Jin must have his own reasons for doing this. He would not harm Jeds for no reason. He will understand, Guevara said softly. His expression was as worried as Majordomo Gale's. Understand. Majordomo Gale was stunned and said in surprise, You know? He just said that Jed's reaction was a little out of control. He hinted that Guevara should find a chance to talk to Jeds and persuade him. Who knew that Guevara would say that he would understand? The Holy See was attacked. What was there to understand? Only then did Guevara realize that he had unknowingly revealed a secret. Of course, other than Majordomo Gale, most people would not be able to grasp the real content from just a few words. Majordomo Gale's question was very strange. Guevara could not help but ask in a low voice, You know too? Majordomo Gale nodded. The two of them looked at each other for a moment and smiled. You have to believe in him. Galbin put away his habitual cynical smile and said solemnly, He is not a person who would betray his friends. When Galbin returned to Wild Willow City, he had always paid attention to Han Jin. He did everything he could to gather information about Han Jin. Later, Sunir came from Wild Willow City to the camp. After a careful conversation, Galbin finally understood Han Jin's experience like the back of his hand. Han Jin had faced huge threats several times and fought to the death to protect his friends. Such a person would not deliberately hurt friends that he could trust. The fact that he could build trust with Han Jin in such a short time was directly related to his judgment. You know too? Majordomo Gale and Guevara asked at the same time. Galbin was stunned for a moment and nodded silently. The three of them kept looking at each other's faces. It was a very strange feeling to keep a top secret together. It made their relationship and trust each other even more. This kid. Guevara smiled bitterly. Doesn't he know? If something goes wrong, someone will die. When many people knew a secret, it was inevitable that it would be leaked. Even if they could keep their mouths shut, if they were not careful when interacting with Jedds, it was very likely that Jedds would find out. Jedds was definitely not a fool. He should have his own confidence, Major Domo Gale said. When he first came in contact with Han Jin, he was able to figure out Han Jin's situation. He could even determine what Han Jin wanted to do and what he would do. However, Han Jin had been growing at an astonishing speed. Now, he could not see anything. He could only guess, or rather, trust. He also knew that this kind of trust was more or less blind. However, facing an unfathomable lord, this was his only choice, just like facing Grand Duke Solomon. I know what his confidence is. Guevara chuckled. What is it? Major Domo Gale picked up his teacup as if nothing had happened, as if he did not care about this question. I'm not telling you. Major Domo Gale glanced at Guevara with contempt. He knew that this would be the result, so he acted as if nothing had happened just now to protect his dignity. Do you guys think that the Thunder Titan's hearing is very sharp? Guevara suddenly changed the topic. Major Domo Gale and Gao Bin could not help but look at Dominique. Dominique was sitting by the side of the ship, looking up at the bright night sky with a relaxed expression. She often sat like this, so everyone was already used to it. Probably not as good as us elves, Gao Bin said. Dominique is a beauty. She became a Thunder Titan at such a young age. Her future is limitless. Guevara said, Who do you think she will fall in love with? It won't be Raphael, Major Domo Gale said. It definitely won't be Raphael, Gao Bin added. Major Domo Gale and Gao Bin looked at each other. They both understood what each other meant. Stop messing around. For various reasons, Sunir might accept Yelena, but she would definitely not accept anyone else. When that time came, who knew what would happen? Why? Guevara did not seem to understand. Nonsense. Major Domo Gale said impatiently. Dominique is so tall. She's not a good match for Han Jin. Don't forget, the stronger a Thunder Titan is, the shorter their body will be. What do you mean? Major Domo Gale was really angry. Gao Bin also looked at Guevara with dissatisfaction. On this issue, they had enough reasons to be on the same side. She heard it, Guevara said. Major Domo Gale and Gao Bin turned their heads to look. Sure enough, the carefree look on Dominguez's face was gone. She looked very embarrassed, and she didn't know where to look. She looked around in panic, and her face was covered with a blush. Dominique! Major Domo Gale shouted. He already understood what Guevara meant. Dominique had most likely heard their conversation. As for whether she understood what they were talking about, only Dominique knew. Dominique glared at Major Domo Gale, then suddenly stood up and jumped off the ship. She landed heavily on the ground with a thud, then strode off into the distance. She won't talk nonsense, right? Gao Bin was a little worried. She won't. Guevara laughed and said, What I said just now was just a joke. You don't have to take it to heart. I know Raphael too well. If it weren't for the sudden attack of the elves and the news that Sunir and Prudence were married, with his relationship with Sunir, he would never accept Yelena. Gao Bin sighed softly, and Major Domo Gale was a little annoyed. The change in their attitudes was enough to prove that the world was unpredictable. Just now, Major Domo Gale and Gao Bin were on the same side, but Guevara's words instantly disintegrated their unified camp. However, the one with the best hearing was not Dominique, but Han Jin. When he heard the conversation between Guevara and the others, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He could only pretend that he didn't hear anything. As the night grew darker, the people on the deck returned to their rooms one after another. Yelena once again entered Han Jin's magic lab. In fact, ever since she had been recognized by Han Jin and everyone else, her desire to improve herself had become weaker and weaker. Although she still meditated, read magic books, and entered the lab frequently, compared to her previous efforts, there was still a huge gap between what she had done before. When she was young, she wanted to be praised by her father. This was her biggest motivation. Now she was satisfied with everything. It was said that a woman's home was the grave of a hero. In fact, a woman's will would also be weakened by happiness. However, Yelena finally knew that Sunir had successfully activated the Mark of God. She had become the third strongest elf after Gao Bin and Prudence. Although Sunir's combat experience might not be as good as Gao Bin and Prudence, her strength was undeniable. This news was like a booster to Yelena's confidence. She didn't like fighting, but she would never allow herself to be outdone by Sunir. Han Jin had opened the magic laboratory for her, which gave her enough confidence. Yelena returned to her old days, seizing every minute and second to practice. Gao Bin still didn't leave. Han Jin felt that Gao Bin seemed to have something to say to him. Since he brought Gao Bin onto the God of War, he had to personally send him off. Therefore, he didn't leave and just waited quietly. There were fewer and fewer people on the deck. After Han Jin left, besides the magicians and mountain warriors on night duty, only Han Jin was left. Gao Bin left his seat and slowly walked to the opposite side of Han Jin. I've always been clear about public and private matters. Gao Bin smiled. But, I know. Han Jin also smiled. But I feel that you've separated public and private matters too clearly. Therefore, you can't see things that you should be able to see clearly. What do you mean? Gao Bin asked in surprise. Nothing. You'll understand in the future. Han Jin said slowly. He was talking about Lydia. Almost everyone with a certain level of observation could see Lydia's feelings for Gao Bin after interacting with Gao Bin and Lydia for a period of time. Only Gao Bin couldn't see anything. This could only mean that Gao Bin had separated public and private matters too clearly. Therefore, he treated Lydia's concern for him, trust for him, and kindness for him as the intimacy between comrades. However, Lydia's face was disfigured, and she was ashamed of her inferiority. Therefore, she refused to show her feelings clearly. If no one pointed it out, the two elves would probably remain the same even after 100 years. Why did you only say half of what you wanted to say? Gao Bin was very dissatisfied. Can't you say it now? Can't say it, Han Jin said lightly. Why? Gao Bin was even more dissatisfied. It's not time yet. Gao Bin turned around helplessly and stroked the beard on his chin thoughtfully. He was an elf who was good at reflecting. Unfortunately, after reflecting for a long time, he still couldn't figure out what he should have seen. Alright, what did you want to say just now? Han Jin changed the topic. I shouldn't talk about public matters with you here, but I really can't help it. Gao Bin sat up straight and said slowly. When do we start dealing with the orcs? The orcs are still very strong. If we attack now, we will also suffer great losses. Han Jin said. I'm not afraid. Gao Bin's tone was full of hatred. This is not a matter of whether you're afraid or not. Since we've already won, why should we pay an unnecessary price? Han Jin thought for a moment. We should have news in 3 to 5 days. 3 to 5 days? So you can't make the decision yourself? Gao Bin was shocked. Begging for monthly votes. I don't think there will be many votes for me to update at this time. I won't be able to catch up. Let's just treat this as my last struggle. Facts always speak louder than words. Of course, the monthly votes are the most meaningful measuring stick. Looking at the dismal number of subscriptions now, perhaps the only way to survive is to completely follow the mainstream. The outline of this book is about 60,000 words. It's too complete. I can't change the plot. Chapter 409. The morning sun slowly rose from the horizon, spreading its warm sunshine to the world. In a small village about 40 miles away from the Holy Crown City, a man slowly turned his face and looked at the morning sun. His face and forehead were covered with wrinkles, which were different from those of ordinary people. They were deep and dense, as if they were carved by a knife. It could even be said that his face was filled with a kind of unbearable aging. But strangely, his eyes were so young, full of vigor and vitality. Gazing at the morning sun, he suddenly smiled. His smile was also different from that of ordinary people. It was mixed with an indescribable sense of satisfaction. Then, he knelt down on the ground little by little, bowing to the splendid morning sun. The surrounding farmers were whispering to each other. Yesterday, when they finished work, they saw this strange man standing under the tree. This morning, when they came out to farm, they saw this strange man again. It seemed that he had not moved for the whole night. However, this strange man didn't seem to care about other people's gazes. After a while, he stood up little by little, gently shaking off the dust on his body. In fact, his clothes were so shabby that they were even worse than those of a beggar. But his movements were so gentle and elegant, as if he was wearing the most expensive clothes in the world. At this moment, a carriage galloped from the distance. A woman with fiery red hair was whipping the horse in front of her with all her might. The horse pulling the carriage was also whipped hard. Although it was so tired that it was foaming at the mouth, it still galloped with all its might. The road was not smooth, and the red carriage was like a spring that kept bouncing. With the naked eye, one could clearly see that the angle between the wheels and the shaft was severely distorted. It made one worry that the carriage would completely fall apart in the next moment. Behind the carriage, about a dozen people were chasing after it. Their clothes were very mixed. Some were wearing magic robes, some were wearing soft armor, and some were wearing tight clothes. They all seemed to be professionals. Farmer raised their heads and temporarily stopped their farm work. The strange man was also watching them attentively. There was a burst of magic waves, and one of the magicians chanted an incantation. Then, he pointed his magic staff forward, and a meteor wrapped in fire whistled down from the sky. In an instant, the two horses in front of the carriage were smashed into a bloody mess, and a large hole was created in the road. The two horses behind couldn't stop their momentum and rushed straight into the hole. One of the horse's brains burst out on the spot, and the other horse didn't fare much better. Its neck curled up like a snake, and it was obvious that its neck bone had been broken. Then, the carriage also sank, but under the huge impact, the carriage suddenly flipped over. It slowly spun twice in the air, and fell heavily on the ground. The red carriage was smashed into pieces, and two people rolled out of it. They rolled along the road for more than 20 meters before they could stabilize themselves. One of them was a woman, and the other was a young man. Both of them had fallen miserably. The young man's head was already broken and bleeding, while the woman's injuries were unclear. However, she kept struggling but couldn't get up. It was obvious that she was also injured. The red-haired woman was much luckier than her companion. She somersaulted a few times in the air and landed in the wheat field that had been plowed by the farmer. Then, she got up quickly and pulled out the giant sword on her back. She screamed, "You guys go, I'll stop them. Go!" The young man struggled to run over and forcefully dragged the woman up from the ground. Then, he staggered forward, shouting as he ran, "Help! Save me! Bandits are robbing!" The young man wanted to call for help, but his shouts had the opposite effect. The farmers immediately scattered and fled back to their own villages. For a normal person to interfere in a battle between professionists was simply courting death. They were all people with families to feed, so no one wanted to joke around with their lives. The people behind had already caught up. They jumped off their horses. The other party had lost the carriage and couldn't escape. "Go!" the red-haired female swordsman roared as she pounced towards the enemy. What was interesting was that the leather armor she wore was also fiery red, making her look like a ball of fire. Her aura was astonishing, but her strength and aura did not match at all. The swordsman at the front pulled out his long sword and faced the incoming fire with a backhand. With a clang, the huge sword in the red-haired female swordsman's hand flew diagonally into the air. Following that, the swordsman flew up and kicked the red-haired female swordsman's chest. The red-haired female swordsman let out a wail as her feet left the ground and her body flew back 7 to 8 meters before she fell to the ground in exhaustion. The swordsman took a few steps forward, then suddenly turned back and asked, "This is useless, right?" "It's useless," a magician said coldly. "Damn, it's just that time is too tight. Look at this body, it's hot. What a pity." The swordsman shook his head and then raised his sword. The red-haired swordswoman wanted to jump up and continue fighting, but her chest and abdomen were seriously injured. She was in so much pain that she couldn't breathe. Blood kept spurting out from her mouth and nostrils. Not to mention fighting, she couldn't even move her body. The swordsman's sword had already slashed down. At this moment, he suddenly felt a blur in front of his eyes. Then, he saw an old face full of wrinkles. He was shocked and wanted to take a few steps back, but found that his wrist was firmly held. "God gave you a pair of strong arms, not to let you bully others, understand?" The old man said softly, "Now, repent your sins." The swordsman's face changed drastically. He struggled with all his might, but he felt that his wrist was surrounded by an iron band. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move it. He almost couldn't believe his eyes. Such thin arms actually had so much strength, and the more he tried, the more intense the pain in his wrist became. In the end, he couldn't hold the sword anymore. The sword fell from his hand and fell to the red-haired swordswoman's body. The old man kicked the hilt of the sword with the tip of his foot. The sword let out an ear-piercing shriek and shot toward the magician on the side. The magician had just raised his magic staff, when he suddenly saw a cold flash, and a strong wind hit him in the face. He had never seen wind become so strong. It was as if he had been punched in the face. He couldn't help but stagger back 7 or 8 steps. When he could open his eyes, he found that the top of the magic staff in his hand had disappeared. He couldn't help but let out a sharp cry. For a magician, a suitable magic staff was equivalent to half their life. In the blink of an eye, half of their life was gone. He couldn't accept this result. The rest of the people were all dumbfounded. Just a moment ago, they had all drawn their weapons and were ready to kill the meddlesome person. Now everyone had turned into statues. They didn't even dare to move a finger. They knew the strength of their companion. A 9th-grade magician would be universally respected anywhere on the continent. In the end, in just a moment, his weapon was destroyed. What would they do if it were them? Of course, their companion was too careless. He didn't even release a magic shield. But, could a magic shield block the sword just now? "Who are you, sir?" someone asked bravely. "I'm just a traveler," the old man said softly. "Sir, they were originally servants of our mercenary group. They colluded to steal our money. We are under the orders of our leader to capture these criminals. We hope that you won't interfere with us," the man said slowly. "Bah!" The red-haired swordswoman spat to show her contempt. However, what she spat out was not saliva, but blood. She was Morrison's childhood playmate, Sylvia. Her natural stubbornness was on full display at this moment. Even if there was no one to help her and she was about to die under the enemy's sword, she would not give in. The two people behind her were naturally Chile and little Joseph. When they saw Sylvia being knocked down, they gave up on running away and rushed toward Sylvia. "Lying is also a sin. It seems that you need to repent seriously." The old man's face became stern. Then, he bent down and waved his hand. A pure white curtain of light fell from the sky and enveloped Sylvia. At this time, Chile and little Joseph had already run back. Seeing this, they did not act rashly. After the white light disappeared, they stood on both sides of Sylvia and helped her up. "You're a priest." The swordsman was shocked. He took a few steps back and slowly moved his wrist. He felt that his wrist bones had been crushed. He could not exert any strength at all. I've said it before. I'm just a traveler. Those people looked at each other. He didn't look like a priest. In their impression, priests were very particular about appearance. If they didn't give the impression of nobility and holiness, who would be willing to believe in them? The old man in front of them was dressed shabbily. He was worse than a beggar. It was impossible to say that he was a priest. However, this old man's strength was obvious to all. He could be described as unfathomable. At least, they couldn't figure him out. "Sir, do you have to interfere with us?" the sorrowful magician asked slowly. "Then shouldn't you at least tell us your name? This way we can go back and answer to the leader. With your strength, do you dare not say it?" "My name is Adolf," the old man said calmly. "Adolf? I'll remember it," the magician said hatefully. Then, he glanced at Chi and the others like a hungry wolf. Then, he waved his hand. "Let's go back." The group of people turned around and walked back. They were about to succeed, but an old man appeared out of nowhere. They were very unhappy, but the situation was beyond their control. In the face of an undefeatable power, they could only retreat. When the group of people jumped on their horses and prepared to retreat, the old man called Adolf suddenly said, "Wait a minute. What else do you want?" The magician turned around and asked angrily. "You haven't repented yet," Adolf said softly. Adolf said softly, "I can see that you are all very violent. You must have done a lot of wrong things in the past. Please believe me, God will only save you if you sincerely repent. Otherwise, you will fall into hell sooner or later." "Repentance, my ass." The magician was furious. He almost went bankrupt to buy a top-grade magic staff. It was destroyed in less than half a month. Now, he even had the mood to kill himself. How could he care about anything else? "Are you blaspheming the gods?" Adolf's face immediately changed, and so did his temperament. Just a moment ago, his tone had always been slow and gentle, but now it was full of steel-like hardness. A piercingly cold and frightening aura was emitted from his body. The air was instantly filled with an invisible pressure, or in other words, it was a repelling force. Including the three of them, including those people who were more than 20 meters away, all of them took a few steps back. The magician's face changed. He never thought that the old man in front of him would have such a strong reaction. Adolf waved his hand and a white ball of light shot out. This was a spell that most priests could easily cast, the bullet of holy light. However, Adolf's bullet of holy light was extremely fast. As he waved his hand forward, the bullet of holy light crossed the distance of more than 20 meters in an instant and hit the magician's face. Blood splattered. The bullet of holy light penetrated the magician's skull and continued to fly forward. It flew for hundreds of meters before disappearing into the air. The magician was still sitting on his horse, as if the attack had no effect on him. However, there was a bowl-sized bloody hole in the center of his head. His eyebrows, eyes, nose, and half of his mouth were gone. His lower lip was intact. The magician's companions could clearly see a row of white lower teeth. They could also see soft and bloody things falling from the top of the circle. Then, the magician slowly fell backward. However, his feet were still in the stirrup. His body lay quietly on the horse's back. The horse under him didn't feel anything and was still snorting leisurely. The swordsman who injured Sylvia reacted quickly. He didn't try to escape, nor did he attack. Instead, he scrambled down from the horse's back and fell to his knees. His right hand was placed horizontally in front of his chest. His eyes were slightly closed, and his mouth was muttering something. No one knew what he was saying. The others immediately came to their senses and scrambled to jump down from their horses. However, their postures were very chaotic. Some of them put their hands together, and some even kowtowed. Their mouths were opening and closing exaggeratedly. Perhaps they didn't know how to pray or repent, but they had to clearly show their mouth. Adolf didn't attack again. He just stood aside and watched quietly. For this group of people, a day felt like a year. Some of them pretended for a long time, and when they saw that Adolf didn't respond, they secretly opened their eyes. When they saw that Adolf was looking at them, they were so scared that they broke out in cold sweat. Reflexively, they closed their eyes tightly again, and their mouths opened and closed even more intensely. Not to mention the accomplices of the blasphemer, even Chi Li and the other two were silent. They didn't dare to move. Sylvia's personality was even more carefree than Morrison's. However, at this moment, she was also frightened by Adolf's thunderous attack. Sometimes, time would pass very slowly. The sun rose higher and higher, and the farmer who had escaped also returned to the wheat field. They curiously looked over and pointed at the wheat field. The number of people on the continent gradually increased. The Orc army was shrinking towards the Biteman army. Some merchant groups with a keen sense of smell felt the signal of peace, and they boldly resumed their trade. Almost everyone who passed by would curiously stop to look at the scene. When they saw the corpse lying on the horse, they hurriedly left. In the end, Sylvia couldn't take it anymore. Although the magic that the old man had cast on her was very effective and greatly reduced her pain, her body was still weak. She needed to sit down and rest. The three of them carefully whispered a few words to each other, and slowly moved to the wheat field and sat on the ridge. If they had to kneel without moving for half an hour, they could grit their teeth and endure it. Any longer and it would be torture. Moreover, they didn't know when it would end, and they didn't have a specific target. Their endurance quickly crumbled. Finally, one of the magicians couldn't take it anymore and fell to the ground. Then, he bounced up as if he had been electrocuted and turned his head to look at Adolf. He suddenly realized that Adolf was looking at him with a smile. Perhaps it was because Adolf's smile was very kind. He gained the courage to stand up unsteadily. "Have you repented?" Adolf asked softly. The magician nodded his head like a chicken pecking at rice. He didn't dare to forget the lesson of the past no matter what. Don't be discouraged. God doesn't care about your past. He only cares about your future. You should start now, understand? The magician continued to nod his head frantically. Okay, you can go now. The magician was wild with joy. He staggered to the side of his horse and wanted to climb up, but his knees were already numb from kneeling. He tried for a long time but still couldn't get up. When the others heard this, they were also happy and stood up one by one. Have you repented? The doctrine didn't allow people to be implicated. Everyone had to be responsible for their own actions, but they didn't have to be responsible for the actions of others, so Adolf didn't want to hurt them. The group of people nodded their heads frantically. The scene was very comical. You can go now. With a loud bang, the group of people scattered, using all their strength to rush towards their horses. However, their movements were very uncoordinated, like a group of zombies. This was not difficult to understand, as they had been kneeling for too long. Sylvia didn't expect such an ending. She was very anxious and wanted to say something. Chili reacted quickly. She pulled Sylvia's arm and signaled Sylvia not to talk nonsense with her eyes. Adolf slowly turned around and walked to Sylvia. Are you better now? His tone was still very soft. Yes, thank you, Sylvia said sincerely. You don't have to thank me. Adolf smiled. It's God who is protecting you, and I'm just the most loyal servant of God. Thank the great God of light. Chili sighed piously. Then she hesitated. Mr. Adolf, can I ask you for a favor? What's the matter? Can you send us to the Holy Crown City? You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.